What's good, everyone? This is Game of Theories, and boy do we have a treat for you. What if Jon Snow refused to let the wildlings through the wall? Hit subscribe and the bell. Let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Gate. The wind came from the north like it always did, mean and personal, like it had chosen Jon specifically to torment. He stood on the walkway above the tunnel gate and watched the torchlight spread across the snow below, a constellation of 10,000 fires that grew wider and brighter with every hour. By dawn, those fires would number 30,000. By the following night, 100,000. Mance Rayder's army had arrived. Jon had known it was coming. He'd walked among them, eaten their food, slept beside their fires, learned the names of their children. He'd kissed a girl with red hair and a wild laugh in a cave that smelled of river stone and pine smoke, and he'd buried that part of himself because he had to, because this was what it had all been for. He was back in black, Longclaw at his hip, and the wall was behind him, and below him was the entire free folk nation pressing south like a tide that had been running for 10,000 years and was finally reaching shore. Ghost sat beside him. The direwolf's red eyes tracked the distant fires with an expression that was not quite hunger and not quite fear, something older than either. "They'll be at the gate by morning," said Ed Tollett from Jon's left, his voice carrying exactly the amount of enthusiasm a man uses when describing his own funeral. 100,000 of them, give or take a few. I've been trying to count the fires, but I keep losing track somewhere around. We're all going to die. "We're not going to die," Jon said. "That's a bold statement from a man standing on top of the only thing between us and them." Jon didn't answer. He was thinking. He'd been thinking since he rode back through the gate 2 days ago, half frozen and bleeding from a crossbow bolt Ygritte had put through his leg, and she'd been crying when she loosed it, which somehow made the wound worse in ways that had nothing to do with flesh. He'd been thinking through the fever, through the Meister's poultices, through Alliser Thorne's clipped questions and barely concealed contempt. He'd been thinking about what he'd seen beyond the wall and what he knew was coming and what the Night's Watch, 400 men strong and crumbling at the seams, could actually do about any of it. The answer he kept arriving at was not the one he wanted. He turned and walked back down the stairs, Ghost flowing behind him like pale smoke. The common hall was crowded in a way it hadn't been in years. Rangers and stewards and builders pressed together around tables, the smell of tallow candles and unwashed wool hanging heavy in the air. Sir Alliser Thorne stood at the head of the room with his back to the fire and his arms crossed, and the way the shadows fell across his face made him look carved from the same black stone as the wall itself. "Snow," Thorne said, not looking up from the table map. "Sir Alliser, sit down. We were just discussing how we intend to hold the gate." He said it the way a schoolmaster says sit down to a student who's been caught sleeping, patient on the surface, scalding underneath. Jon sat. Around the table were the senior officers of the Night's Watch, what was left of them. Bowen Marsh, whose soft face had grown harder with every ranging that came back short. Othel Yarwick, who managed the builders and had the permanently startled expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news for so long that the bad news arriving actually calmed him down. 3 other rangers whose names Jon knew and whose experience he respected, even if he didn't always agree with their conclusion. "The gate holds," Thorne continued. "We do not open it, we do not negotiate with them. They cannot climb the wall in their numbers. The cold alone will kill 1/3 of them before the moon turns. We wait them out." Silence around the table, the kind that meant everyone was thinking the same thing and nobody wanted to say it first. Jon said it. "They won't wait," he said. "Mance Rayder has been hurting 100,000 people through the longest winter in living memory. Half of them are starving. 1/4 have already lost someone to the cold or to things worse than cold. They're not stopping. Then they'll throw themselves at the wall," Thorne said, "and we'll kill them." "We'll kill some of them," Jon said, "with 400 men against 100,000. The wall is 700 feet of ice snow. It is not a fortification that requires bodies to hold it. They cannot bring it down. They cannot scale it in numbers that would threaten us. They can come through the gate." Jon's voice was level. "The tunnel, if they breach it, we lose everything. The gate holds, for now." Thorne finally looked at him. Those eyes, cold gray, perpetually unimpressed, had been looking at Jon that way since he was a green boy of 14, and they'd never stopped. "You have a suggestion, I assume. You always have a suggestion." "We don't let them through," Jon said, and felt the words settle strangely in his mouth because he'd been turning this over for 2 days and it still didn't sit right, but it was still what he believed. "But we don't fight them either. We talk." Someone at the table made a sound that was either a laugh or a cough. "Talk," Thorne repeated. "To Mance, directly. I know him. I know how he thinks." Jon put both hands flat on the table. "He didn't march 100,000 people to the wall because he wants to conquer the South. He wants to survive. He's running from something, and if we can make him understand that we know what that something is, and that we're the only chance any of them have, you're suggesting we negotiate with raiders and murderers and cannibals. I'm suggesting we survive the winter, Jon said, which is considerably harder than holding a gate. The silence that followed was a different kind, not the silence of people thinking the same thing, but of people trying to decide if the young man across the table was brilliant or insane, and leaning toward insane but not quite willing to dismiss him. What is it, Bowen Marsh said carefully, that you think they're running from specifically? Jon looked at him. He'd told the story twice already, to the Lord Commander Mormont's replacement, to Thorne, to the senior staff. He told it plainly and without embellishment, and watched their faces do the thing faces always did when he told it. The initial attention, the gradual tightening around the eyes, the retreat into skepticism, as if the facts themselves were too large to live inside and the mind kept pushing them back out. The White Walkers, Jon said, the army of the dead, you've had the reports. The bodies at the Fist of the First Men, Mormont's Raven, we've had confused reports from frightened men, Thorne said. I was there. Jon's voice didn't rise. He'd learned not to let it rise with Thorne, because Thorne fed on it. The older man used anger the way a sailor uses wind, and the calmer Jon stayed, the less fuel there was. I saw them. I killed one. I watched it burn blue and fall apart in front of me. You saw something in the dark beyond the wall, Thorne said. I don't doubt that you believe what you saw. I do doubt that what you saw was a 10,000-year-old fairy story come to life. Then what killed 200 rangers at the Fist of the First Men? No answer. What turned them and brought them back walking? Jon pressed. What drove every wildling tribe, clans that have been killing each other for generations, to stop fighting and move in the same direction at the same time? 100,000 people don't run from a fairy story, Sir Alliser. Another silence. This one was harder. Thorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The gate holds, Thorne said again, final as iron. We do not negotiate with wildlings. The Night's Watch has held this wall for 8,000 years without parleying with savages, and I will not be the man who changes that. Take your suggestion, and I'm not asking for your permission, Jon said. Every head at the table turned toward him. Thorne went very still. Ghost, lying against the wall behind Jon, raised his great white head. I beg your pardon, Thorne said quietly. Lord Commander Mormont trusted my judgment beyond the wall, Jon said. He wasn't being aggressive, he was being precise, which Thorne found considerably more infuriating. In the absence of a Lord Commander, the ranging is my responsibility. I know what's out there, I know what's coming, and I know Mance Rayder. He stood. I'm going to send a raven to his forward camp tonight. I'm going to request a meeting under a flag of truce at the south side of the gate, and I'm going to tell him that we have a proposal. You'll do nothing of the sort. If he says no, nothing changes. If he says yes, we buy time. Jon looked at each man around the table in turn. Time is the only currency we have right now. Everything else we're already spending. He walked out before Thorne could respond. He heard the man start after him and then stop, probably because hitting Jon in front of the full table would cross a line even Thorne wouldn't cross, and probably because, underneath the contempt and the ideology and the 30 years of certainty, Alliser Thorne was not actually a stupid man. He knew the numbers, he'd seen the distances on that table map. He just hated that Jon was the one saying it. Jon found Sam in the library, which was where Sam always was when the world felt like it was ending, surrounded by books, as if the answers were in there somewhere and it was only a matter of looking long enough. Sam Tarley was the only man at Castle Black who could look genuinely comfortable in circumstances that would have broken most people, solely because his definition of comfort was being allowed to read. You heard, Jon said. I was outside the door, Sam admitted, not looking up. I wasn't eavesdropping, I was just standing near it while it was happening. That's eavesdropping, Sam. I prefer to think of it as being spatially adjacent to information. Jon almost smiled. He sat down across from Sam's mountain of scrolls and leaned forward on his elbows. Tell me I'm right. Sam finally looked up. His round face was serious in the candlelight, genuinely serious, the way it got when he was thinking hard rather than worrying hard, which were two different expressions, and Jon had learned to tell them apart. About the army of the dead, about Mance, about the gate. Sam set his quill down. You're right that holding the gate and fighting 100,000 people is a death sentence for 400 men. You're right that Mance isn't a conqueror. You're right that the White Walkers are the actual enemy. He paused. You're also right that letting 100,000 armed wildlings through the wall into an unprepared Westeros could be catastrophic in ways that are hard to predict. People would die, small folk, villages, even if Mance controls his people, and that's a significant if. 100,000 starving, desperate people moving south is not a simple humanitarian corridor. So what's wrong with negotiating first, buying time, finding out what they actually need before we start making assumptions? Nothing's wrong with it, Sam said. Nothing except that it requires Mance Rayder to trust a crow, and it requires our side to trust a wildling king, and human beings are historically terrible at trusting people they've been told are enemies. I'll manage Mance, Jon said. What about our side? Jon was quiet for a moment. I'll manage that too. Sam looked at him with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. Jon, be careful. Thorne isn't Lord Commander. No, but he has the ear of everyone who might become Lord Commander. And if you go out that gate without authorization and come back having made a deal that half the watch hates, he'll use it to bury you. Then I'll just have to make a deal that works, Jon said simply. He stood. Write the Raven message for me. Your letters are better than mine. Oh, certainly, Sam muttered, reaching for fresh parchment. At some point I'm going to develop a spine and say no to you, just not tonight. The Raven went north just before midnight, carried by one of the watch's fastest birds with a message that Jon had dictated, and Sam had refined into something that was honest without being vulnerable. I am Jon Snow, formerly of the ranging party captured by your forces. I know what drives you south. I have a proposal. Come to the south gate at dawn under a white flag, and we will speak, you and I, without weapons drawn. He didn't sleep. He sat on the wall above the gate and watched the wildling fires burn and tried to remember everything he knew about Mance Rayder. The way the man talked, deliberate and musical, like someone who'd grown up in two worlds and belonged entirely to neither. The way he laughed, big and sudden and real. The way his eyes went flat and very quiet when he was actually angry, which was more frightening than anything loud. Mance was smart. That was the essential thing. He was smarter than most men Jon had met, and Jon had met some extraordinary men. He would read the Raven message and understand it immediately, not just the words but the context, the admission embedded in I have a proposal, the vulnerability of sending a crow to a king. He would understand that the crow who sent it was not operating with his brother's blessing, and he would either see that as weakness or as honesty. Jon thought he'd see it as honesty. He hoped he was right. Ghosts stretched out across his feet and radiated warmth through the cold, and Jon watched the fires and thought about the dead walking in the wall above him. 700 feet of ancient ice, as old as the world it was built to protect, and wondered not for the first time whether the wall was the thing that was going to save them or the thing that was going to kill them. The flag went up at dawn, white cloth on a spear. Jon saw it from the walkway and felt something loosen in his chest. He told Ed to keep the gate closed and went down alone. The south side of the tunnel gate had a small chamber built into the wall's base, barely a room, more of a deliberate widening of the passage, with iron torches in wall brackets and a stone bench that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought comfort was for Southerners. Jon waited there with Ghost at his side and Longclaw at his hip and no bow, because showing up to a negotiation armed only with a sword was either a statement of trust or a statement of confidence, and he wanted it to be both. He didn't have to wait long. The gate opened barely a crack, enough for a man to step through, no more, and Mance Rayder ducked under the iron lintel and stood up straight inside the tunnel chamber and looked at Jon the way a man looks at something he expected and didn't quite expect at the same time. He was larger than Jon remembered, or maybe the tunnel made him seem larger. He wore furs that had seen better decades, and his beard was thicker than when Jon last saw him, and there were new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. But those eyes, gray-green and steady, missing nothing, were exactly as Jon remembered. Tormund Giantsbane was behind him. Of course he was. Tormund stepped into the chamber and took one look at Jon and broke into the widest, most genuine grin Jon had seen in months. Snow, you lived, you miserable bastard. I told Mance, I said that one's too stupid to die and look. He spread his hands as if Jon's existence was a personal accomplishment. Here you are, alive, being stupid. Good to see you too, Tormund, Jon said, and he meant it. How's your leg? Ygritte said she was aiming for the heart. She hit the leg. That's love, boy, Tormund said, nodding sagely. The heart's too quick. Leg says I still want you alive. I'm just very, very angry. Mance hadn't spoken yet. He was looking at Jon with the patient, measuring attention of a man who makes no decisions until he's finished watching. Jon let him look. Ghost sat and watched Mance back with those blood-red eyes, and Mance's gaze flickered to the wolf once and then returned to Jon with something new in it, a fractional adjustment, a small upgrade of assessment. You're not acting with your order's blessing, Mance said finally. His voice was exactly as Jon remembered, unhurried, thoughtful, the voice of a man who learned long ago that volume is a substitute for authority and he had the real thing. No, Jon said, that took either courage or desperation. Bit of both, probably. Mance almost smiled. "Sit down, Jon Snow." They sat, Mance on the bench, Jon across from him, Tormund against the wall with his arms folded, the ghost-white direwolf between them like a line neither man was quite willing to cross. Outside the tunnel, 700 feet of ice and 100,000 lives pressed on both sides of the same question. "You know what's behind us," Mance said, not a question. "Yes, you saw them. At the Fist of the First Men, before that, further north." Jon paused. "I saw a white walker up close. I killed it." Mance looked at him steadily. "With what?" Jon touched the hilt of Longclaw. "Valyrian steel." Something crossed Mance's face, relief and grief in almost equal parts, the expression of a man who's been trying to tell a story that no one believes and has just found one person who already knows it. He pressed his lips together and breathed out slowly through his nose. "How many does your watch think are coming? They don't believe any are coming." "And you?" "Thousands," Jon said. "Tens of thousands, maybe more, moving slow but moving. And the things they kill." He stopped. He didn't need to say it. Mance had seen it. "Don't come back the same way they fell," Mance said quietly. Tormund had gone still. "No," Jon agreed, "they don't." The silence in the tunnel was different from any silence Jon had sat in before. It had weight and texture and a kind of awful companionship to it. Two men from different worlds, both knowing a thing that neither world was ready to believe, sitting in the only inch of ground that belonged to neither of them. "Then you understand why I came south," Mance said. "All of us, every clan, every tribe, people who have been killing each other since before your wall was built. I didn't conquer them, I convinced them." "Do you know how hard that is?" "I'm beginning to find out." Mance looked at him sharply. Then for the first time he smiled, a real one, tired and wry and not particularly happy. "You want to make a deal. I want to make a deal that isn't, open the gate and we'll try not to die of each other." "What then?" Jon leaned forward. This was the part he'd been working on since the fever broke, since he lay in the Meister's room staring at the stone ceiling and thinking there has to be a third option. The watch's position was, don't open the gate, hold the wall, die slowly of numbers. Mance's position was, open the gate or die quickly of cold. And both positions were going to end in corpses wearing the faces of people Jon knew. "Your people need to come south," Jon said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to go back. But I'm asking you to wait 2 weeks, maybe 3, while I work on the problem of how." Mance frowned. "My people are starving. I know, we have food stores. Your food stores would last my people 3 days. "Then we need more," Jon said. "If the Watch sends ravens to Winterfell, to Castle Serwyn, to any keep within range, they'd respond to a request from the Night's Watch. We've been here 8,000 years. People still remember what that means. I can get food to the camps beyond the wall within a week. In exchange for what? Your word that you'll hold your people back from the gate until a proper arrangement can be negotiated. And if your order refuses to negotiate, then we'll have bought a week and I'll find another way." Jon held the man's gaze. "I'm not trying to trap you. I'm not trying to trap your people. I know what's coming and I know we can't face it like this. 400 crows and 100,000 free folk who hate each other staring at opposite sides of the same wall. We need to be on the same side of it before the dead arrive, or none of this matters. Any of it. The gate, the wall, the ancient traditions of the Night's Watch, it all becomes irrelevant when the army of the dead reaches here." Mance was quiet for a long time. Tormund against the wall was watching Jon with an expression that was somewhere between fondness and genuine wonder, as if Jon was a particularly entertaining ox who had just begun to speak. "He's not lying," Tormund said to Mance, unprompted and apparently feeling that his credentials as a Jon Snow expert were worth invoking. "Boy never learned how to lie properly. Drove Ygritte mad." "I noticed," Mance said. "The dead, though," Tormund added, and his voice changed. The grin fell away and left something older underneath. "I saw what he's talking about, 3 weeks north of here. A white one of our own, Dalla's brother, man I've known since he was 3 feet tall. It took 6 men to put him down and he was dead the whole time. Dead eyes, nothing behind them." He shook his head slowly. "That's not something you talk your way past, Mance." Mance turned back to Jon. 2 weeks, 2 weeks, Jon confirmed. "Food supply begins within 5 days or the deal's off and we come through that gate whether you open it or not." 5 days, Jon agreed. "And Snow," Mance leaned forward, his voice dropping to something that was not a threat but was close enough to one to be worth attention. "If this is a trap, if your brothers mean to use this pause to bring southern forces against us, I will burn that gate down and walk my 100,000 people through the ashes, and I will not feel bad about it. If I were going to trap you," Jon said, "I wouldn't have come alone." Mance looked at him for another long moment, then he stood and held out his hand. Jon stood and shook it. Tormund made a noise that might have been a sniffle. When Jon looked at him, the big man immediately assumed an expression of stern dignity. "Smoke from the torches," he said, "gets in my eyes." Jon walked back through the tunnel and up to the wall and stood in the sharp morning light with the smell of ice in his lungs and his heart beating in his ears and thought, right, now the hard part. The hard part arrived in the form of Alliser Thorne and Bowen Marsh and two senior rangers waiting at the top of the tunnel stair with expressions arranged in various formations of displeasure. Thorne's displeasure was the most architectural, carefully constructed, precisely maintained, the displeasure of a man who had been waiting for an opportunity and had just watched it materialize. "You opened the gate," Thorne said. "I opened the gate a crack," Jon said, moving past him. "For a conversation, that is not authorized, neither is dying of stubbornness." Jon kept walking. "I've bought us 2 weeks. Mance will hold his people back from the gate in exchange for food supply and the opening of proper negotiations." "There will be no negotiations." Jon stopped and turned around. Ghost had fallen into step behind him and now stood between him and Thorne, not growling, just present, 7 stone of white direwolf positioned with the particular casual precision of an animal that doesn't need to threaten because it doesn't need to. "Sir Alliser," Jon said, "I understand your position. I respect the tradition it comes from. 8,000 years of this order keeping that line." He gestured north and never blinking. "That matters, I know it matters." He held the older man's gaze. "But the thing we built that line to keep out is here now. It's real, it's moving. And holding the line the same way we've always held it, against the same people we've always held it against, while the actual threat that the line was built for marches toward us, that's not tradition, that's suicide." Thorne's jaw worked. "You are a junior ranger. I am the only man in this castle who has seen the White Walkers, survived them, and come back to tell it," Jon said quietly. "I'm not junior to anything that matters right now." Herndon walked away. This time nobody followed. Sam fell into step beside him from somewhere. Jon wasn't sure where he'd appeared from. Possibly he'd simply materialized out of accumulated worry and matched his pace with the determined waddle that passed for Sam's jogging. "How did it go?" Sam asked breathlessly. "Better than it should have," Jon said. "Is that good? Ask me in 2 weeks." He paused. "I need you to start drafting ravens. Winterfell, Serwyn, maybe as far south as the Umbers. Food, we need to call in every favor the Night's Watch has ever been owed, and we need to do it before anyone in this castle officially objects. Thorne will." "Thorne will hate it," Jon agreed, "right fast." Sam gave a small, slightly hysterical laugh and turned back toward the library at speed, his robes flapping. Jon watched him go and then turned back toward the north, hands wrapped around the battlements, eyes on the tree line where the wildling fires were beginning to die down in the morning light. Not gone, just banked, waiting. He thought about Ygritte, somewhere in that sea of camps and cookfires. He thought about the look on her face when she'd put the arrow in his leg, the tears she hadn't been able to stop, and the way she'd said his name when they were still on the same side of everything. He thought about the army of the dead that neither side of this wall knew how to stop, and the gate below him, and the deal he'd just made that nobody had authorized and everyone was going to hate. He was right. He knew he was right. That didn't make it easier. Ghost pressed against his side, warm and solid as stone, and Jon breathed in the cold northern air, the only air he'd ever really known, and held the certainty in himself like a coal against the wind. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to save the world from itself before it had to start worrying about saving itself from the dark. It wasn't enough time. It was all he had. That night 3 ravens flew south with letters that had not been authorized by any ranking officer of the Night's Watch. They carried Jon Snow's name, Sam Tarley's handwriting, and a request for food that framed itself as emergency supply for a watch in crisis, which was, Jon reflected, almost entirely accurate. As they flew, somewhere 3 miles north of the wall, a patrol of wildling scouts encountered something in the tree line that had not been alive for a long time and was not behaving as dead things ought to behave. By the time the screaming stopped, there were 4 fewer scouts and 4 more of something else, moving south through the dark with the patient, purposeful gait of things that had nowhere to be and all the time in the world. Jon didn't know about it yet. By morning he would. Chapter 2, Kings and Crows. The screaming reached him before the runner did. Jon was in the middle of his 3rd argument of the morning with Bowen Marsh about grain stores, a conversation that had the structural integrity of a house built from wet paper, when the sound came over the wall. Not through it, over it, carried on the wind from the north like something the cold had decided to deliver personally. It was distant and brief, and then it was gone, and for a moment Jon thought he'd imagined it. Then the wildling runner came through the gate crack, bleeding from his shoulder and speaking in the old tongue so fast that even Jon, who'd learned enough to get by, could barely follow. Ghost was on his feet before the man finished the first sentence. Tormund translated, which told Jon that Mance had sent him along for exactly this purpose. He'd anticipated that the watch's old tongue was limited, which was either thoughtful or a sign that he'd expected something to go wrong quickly. 4 scouts, Tormund said, and his voice had lost all its usual performance, just flat and straight and serious. 3 miles north found something in the haunted forest, something that used to be a man named Bale, big fellow, red beard, been ranging the milkwater for 20 years. He paused, wasn't Bale anymore when they found him. White, Jon said, 4 of them by the time the scouts stopped running. Tormund looked at Jon directly. 3 scouts didn't run fast enough. The marsh argument was over. Jon was already moving. He found Mance's camp commander, a lean-weathered wildling woman named Gritta, who ran Mance's forward position with the efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that efficiency was the only thing standing between her people and extinction at the edge of the camp line. She confirmed what Tormund had said and added details that made it worse. The whites had been moving south, not milling, not wandering the way corpses in stories wandered. Moving south with a specific, horrible directness, the way water moves when it's found a crack. Which direction did they go when your scouts scattered? Jon asked. Gritta pointed, due south, toward the wall. How long ago? 4 hours, maybe 5. Jon looked up at the wall rising behind him, impossibly huge in the early light, and did the arithmetic. Whites didn't move fast. They moved the way cold moved, relentless, indifferent, patient. 4 hours at a white's pace through the haunted forest put them close, too close. He went back through the gate at a run. Thorne was going to love this, in the particular way that people love being proven right about things they wish they'd been wrong about. Jon bypassed him entirely and went straight to the top of the wall where 3 rangers with good eyes and bows were already peering north into the tree line. Anything? Jon asked. Movement, said one of them, a seasoned ranger named Pike who'd been ranging for 15 years and had the careful, conservative manner of a man who survived by never saying more than he could prove. About 400 yards out. Hard to see in the shadows under the trees, but it's not an animal. Jon looked. The haunted forest stretched away to the north, dark and dense despite the snow, the trees crowded close enough that the shadows between them were almost absolute. He stared for a long time and let his eyes adjust and let his mind stop trying to find what it expected and just look at what was there. There. In the dark space between 2 large pines, something that was approximately the shape of a man and was approximately standing still, except for the occasional movement that was wrong in a way that was very hard to describe and impossible to mistake once you'd seen it before. The way a dead thing moves when it moves, not like muscle and intention, but like something being operated from a distance. 3 of them, Jon said, 2 more to the left by the birches. Pike squinted. I only see 2. There are 3, Jon turned from the battlements. Get me Ed and 6 men, armed, real weapons, axes, swords, nothing that needs flame to be lit at a moment's notice. He thought for a second. Actually, get torches too. You're not. Pike started. Get me Ed, Jon said simply and walked away toward the stairs. He was pulling on his second gauntlet in the armory when Ed arrived with the expression of a man who has given up on being surprised but hasn't quite given up on being appalled. We're going out, Ed said. It wasn't a question. Into the forest where the dead things are. Yes, right. Ed strapped on his own gauntlet. I'd like it noted, for whatever record exists of these proceedings, that I think this is a terrible idea. Noted. I'd also like it noted that I'm doing it anyway, which either speaks well of my loyalty or very poorly of my judgment. Probably both, Jon said. Where's Ghost? Ghost was already at the armory door. Tormund met them outside the gate with 12 wildling fighters and an expression that said he'd already decided he was coming and was prepared to argue about it at length if necessary. Jon looked at him, looked at the 12 fighters, big, capable, armed with axes and short spears, the kind of people who'd been surviving the real north their whole lives, looked back at Tormund. Fine, he said. Good, Tormund said, falling into step beside him. My people have been fighting these things longer than your people have admitted they exist. A little credit, please. Don't get any of your people killed. Don't get any of your people killed, Tormund replied. I've got more to spare. It was, Jon recognized, probably not the right moment to laugh. He didn't laugh, but it was close. They moved north in a loose formation, Jon and Ghost at the point, Ed and 3 rangers flanking. Tormund and the wildlings spread wide to cover approaches from the sides. The snow under the trees was deep and soft and silent, and the cold this far north had a different quality than the cold on the wall, older somehow, as if the temperature here remembered what the world had been before men put names to things and decided that the names made them less dangerous. Ghost moved without sound 15 yards ahead, his white coat almost invisible against the snow, only the red eyes tracking back and forth like coals in the dark. Jon had learned to read the wolf the way a sailor reads current, Ghost's pace, the set of his shoulders, the precise angle of his ears, and right now everything Ghost was broadcasting said close and multiple and wrong. Jon raised a fist. Everyone stopped. 40 yards ahead, half behind a fallen trunk that had been down long enough to have its own ecosystem of frozen moss and ice, 3 wights stood in a loose cluster. They weren't doing anything. That was the worst part, the nothing they were doing. Animals stop, humans stop. These things hadn't stopped in the way that either of those implied rest or consideration. They'd simply ceased forward motion temporarily, the way a river ceases motion when you dam it. The pressure was still there. The direction was still there. They were just waiting for what Jon couldn't say. He wasn't sure they were waiting for anything. He wasn't sure there was a for involved. One of them had been a large man with a red beard. Jon could see that clearly enough. Torches, Jon said quietly. The torches came forward, 6 of them already lit, because Ed had made sure of that. Bless Ed for his meticulousness, and the orange light pushed the shadows back enough to see clearly. The wights reacted to the torches. Their heads turned, not all at once, not the way a group of people all looks at the same thing, but sequentially, like a message traveling down a line. Spread wide, Jon said, just loud enough for his people to hear. Don't bunch, single targets are harder. The wights came over the fallen tree. They didn't run, it was faster than walking, but it wasn't running. It was something in between that had none of the inefficiency of either, and the first one closed 40 yards to 20 in what felt like 3 seconds. Jon had Longclaw out and stepped to meet it. The wight that had been Bale reached for him with a hand that was simultaneously a hand and a claw and something else, some third thing that didn't have a word yet, and Jon brought Longclaw up and across in a tight arc that took the arm off at the elbow and kept moving in the same motion to drive the blade through the wight's torso. The steel went in clean, and the wight didn't react the way a living thing reacts. No flinch, no collapse, just a momentary interruption of its forward motion, and Jon had already pivoted away because he'd seen this before, and he knew that hitting them was just slowing them down. Torches, he shouted. A wildling fighter, compact, quick-footed, drove her torch into the Bale White's side, and the thing went up. Not gradually. Not the way a log catches. Fast, the way the wrong kind of thing burns when it's been cold for a long time and something very hot reaches it. The wight turned into a pillar of blue-white flame and fell and was gone, and the smell it left behind was wrong and sharp and nothing Jon had ever smelled in a butcher's shop or a battlefield. The second wight had Ed. Not grabbed him, it had both hands around his left arm and was dragging him backward with absolute, terrible purpose, and Ed was making a sound that was trying to be very calm and not quite succeeding. One of the rangers drove a sword into the wight's back and another drove a torch into its neck, and it released Ed and burned, and the whole engagement was 12 seconds from contact to ash. The third wight got within 10 yards of Tormund, and then Ghost hit it from the side. The direwolf was 140 pounds of absolute conviction, and he hit the wight hard enough to knock it into a tree, and then he was on top of it with his jaws finding its throat the way a wolf's jaws find a throat by instinct and design, and he shook it the way a dog shakes a rabbit. The wight clawed at Ghost and drew nothing. The white fur didn't seem to give it purchase, and a wildling fighter stepped in and put a torch to it while Ghost held it down. 12 seconds after that, it was over. Jon stood in the smoking aftermath and checked his people. Ed's arm would bruise spectacularly, but nothing was broken or bitten. 2 of the wildlings had cuts. Ghost had a shallow gash along his left shoulder that he was already ignoring with the complete indifference to injury that seemed to be a fundamental direwolf personality trait. Nobody was dead. Nobody had turned. Jon exhaled. Right, Tormund said from behind him. He sounded steady, but his breathing was slightly elevated and there was sweat on his face despite the cold. Right, so that's what we're all eventually dealing with. He looked at the ash patches in the snow. In 100,000s. Yes, Jon said. Tormund rubbed his beard with both hands. I need a drink, he said, and I'm going to need Mance to see this. Mance Rayder arrived at the south gate an hour later, not because Jon requested it, but because Tormund had apparently gone back to camp and described what he'd seen with such colorful, unembellished horror that Mance had saddled up and ridden to the wall before anyone could counsel caution. He stood in the tunnel chamber again and looked at the ash Jon had brought back in a clay pot. Ash and one fragment of bone that hadn't quite burned, pale and cold and completely odorless in a way that made it somehow worse than if it had smelled like anything at all. 3 miles north, Jon said. Moving south, we burned 3 of them. There may be more we didn't see. Mance looked at the bone fragment for a long time, then he looked at Jon. Tell me what you know, all of it. So Jon told him. Not the edited version he gave the watch, the full account, from the fist of the first men to Craster's Keep to the White Walker he'd faced in the snow north of the Skirling Pass. The blue eyes and the bladed arm in the way Longclaw had shattered it like frozen glass. He told it the way Sam had told him to tell it once in a late-night conversation in the library. All of it, Jon, not just the facts but the shape of it, what it felt like, because people believe feelings before they believe reports. Mance listened without interrupting. This, Jon had come to understand, was one of Mance's most formidable qualities. He actually listened, not impatiently waiting for his turn, but genuinely taking in what was said, filing and connecting and building a picture in real time. It was the quality that had let him unite 100 disparate, hostile tribes behind a single purpose, because each tribe's leader had felt when talking to Mance that they'd been heard. "The Valyrian steel," Mance said when Jon finished. "Are there other weapons that work? Dragonglass, obsidian? We found caches of it at the Fist, old Night's Watch supply from 8,000 years ago. How much? Not enough," Jon said. "Not nearly enough. And fire slows them, burns them eventually. But fire is crowd control, not a battle strategy. You can't torch a 10,000-strong army of whites with torches." Jon paused. "We need more dragonglass, and we need more Valyrian steel. The former might be findable. Dragonstone supposedly sits on a mountain of it. The latter..." He shook his head. "There are maybe 200 Valyrian steel blades in all of Westeros. They're spread across noble houses who have had them for generations and have no idea what they're actually for." Mance was quiet. Outside the tunnel, wind, the wall creaking infinitesimally above them, not in weakness, just the normal settling of an old thing in cold. A sound like the world breathing. "You need the South," Mance said. "We need the South, and the South needs to understand what's coming. They don't believe it yet, then make them believe it." Mance looked at him with something new in his expression, the particular attention of a man who has been solving an impossible problem and has just realized that the person across from him might be a piece of the solution. "You have two worlds, Jon Snow. You have the black of your order and whatever you brought back from ours. That's not nothing. Most men get one world. You've got both. Most men don't get shot in the leg by a girl they..." Jon stopped. Mance, to his credit, did not smile. "How is Ygritte?" "I don't know," Jon said, which was honest and hurt in a way he hadn't expected when he heard himself say it out loud. "She's angry," Mance said simply, "but she's alive. Anger keeps people alive. It's the best thing I can wish on anyone this winter." A pause, then Jon said, "The deal stands. 2 weeks, my ravens have gone south. Food will come." He looked at Mance directly. "But I need something from you in exchange for the time this buys." "Name it." "I need to meet with your clan leaders, all of them, every major chief who marched south with you. Not to negotiate passage, not yet, just to let them see me and hear what I know about the dead." Jon kept his voice level. "Because when we do eventually open that gate, and we will, there's no version of this that doesn't end with your people south of the wall. I need them to understand that what I'm offering them isn't charity. It's an alliance against something that will kill all of us equally, wildling and crow alike." Mance studied him. "You sound very sure we'll open the gate. I'm sure the alternative is worse. And your brothers, the ones who want to hold the line forever. I'll handle them," Jon said. Said it without hesitation and without bravado, just as a simple statement of intent, and something in the certainty of it made Mance Rayder, a man who had seen and evaluated a great many people in his complicated life, sit back slightly and reassess the young man across from him with the kind of attention you give something you originally categorized incorrectly. "The clan meeting," Mance said. "Tomorrow, sunrise, north of the wall, half a mile out. I'll have every chief who matters." He stood. "Come alone or bring two. Anyone who comes armed for a fight doesn't get past my outer guard." "I'll bring Ed," Jon said. "Why Ed?" "Because he'll complain loudly enough that everyone within earshot will know he's not hiding anything." Tormund made a sound from the corner. This time Jon was fairly certain it was a laugh. He should have told Thorne about the meeting. He knew that. He went back and forth about it for 3 hours, drafting arguments in his head, testing each one against Thorne's anticipated responses, and every version ended the same way, with Thorne forbidding it, Jon going anyway, and the breach between them becoming something structural and permanent, which it was probably going to become anyway, Jon acknowledged. But there was a difference between a breach that happened around something that worked and a breach that happened around something that was stopped before it could. He told Sam instead. Sam listened, made 3 separate worried faces in quick succession, and then said, "You know what the ironically funny thing is? You're right about all of it. Tactically, strategically, morally, you're correct. The problem isn't your argument, it's your position. A junior ranger making unilateral foreign policy for an 8,000-year-old military order is going to create enemies regardless of the quality of the policy." "I know," Jon said. "Just wanted to make sure you know," Sam said. "So that when it goes wrong you can't say you didn't know. It's not going to go wrong. Famous last words. Sam paused. What will you say to the clan chiefs? The truth, Jon said. Same thing I said to Mance. Show them what's coming. Don't dress it up. Don't make it political. Just tell them what I've seen and let them make their own minds up. Wild people tend to trust experience over rhetoric, Sam said, in the tone of someone who had read everything ever written about the free folk and found it genuinely interesting rather than politically useful. They'll respond better to a story than to a strategic argument. That's what I figured. Tell them about the white at Craster's Keep, Sam said. The baby. He paused, and his round face had gone quite still. Nothing makes the stakes real faster than what happens to children. Jon didn't answer immediately. The baby at Craster's Keep, the thing that Craster's Keep had been all those generations, the old monsters tithing to the cold, was a thing he tried not to carry in the front of his mind because of what it felt like when he did. Yes, he said eventually. I'll tell them about that. Thorne found him before dawn. Jon was checking his weapons in the armory, the quiet, methodical pre-dawn checking that he'd developed as a habit, a way of steadying himself before anything important happened, and he heard the door and knew by the quality of the footstep. Thorne walked like a man who owned wherever he was walking. You're going out again, Thorne said. Yes, to meet with wildlings, to meet with their clan chiefs. Jon didn't stop what he was doing. To tell them what's coming from the north and to begin establishing the kind of trust that means when we do open that gate, it doesn't turn into a massacre on either side. Thorne was quiet for a moment. Jon could feel the quality of that quiet. It wasn't the quiet of a man with nothing to say. It was the quiet of a man choosing his words with unusual care, which was unusual enough for Thorne to be notable. You believe it, Thorne said. Everything you've said about the dead, you genuinely believe it. Jon turned and looked at him. You were at the burning of the two whites that attacked Lord Commander Mormont, Jon said. You saw that with your own eyes. I saw two dead men that didn't stay dead, Thorne said. I saw them stopped by fire. I extrapolated a contained threat, not an existential one. The difference between a river and a flood is quantity, Jon said, not nature. Thorne looked at him, that long, flat, assessing look that Jon had been receiving since he was 14. You have your father's certainty, he said finally. Ned Stark could walk into a room and state something impossible and everyone in it would believe him because he believed it so absolutely that disbelief felt like the eccentric position. He paused. It's an extraordinary quality, boy. It's also how good men get themselves killed. Jon held his gaze. Were you close with him, my father? I respected him. It came out crisp and immediate, reflexive. He made decisions I disagreed with. He made them with conviction and he lived by them. And died by them, Jon said. Yes, something passed across Thorne's face, not quite feeling but the shape where a feeling had been. And died by them. Jon picked up Longclaw and belted it on. I'm going to the meeting. I'm going alone except for Ed. I'm going to be back by mid-morning and I'm going to give you a full report. He moved toward the door. After that, if you want to confine me, you can try. He walked past Thorne into the gray pre-dawn corridor, and Thorne, to Jon's genuine surprise, did not follow. The wildling camp at half a mile north was a different world from the Watch's side of the wall in the same way that a forest is a different world from a field, wilder, louder, more complex in its silences. Jon had lived in it once. The smell of it was immediate and specific, cookfare smoke and animal hide, and something that was collectively the smell of people who lived hard outdoor lives, which was not unpleasant, just different, in the way that all honest smells are just different. There were 20 clan chiefs assembled in a loose semicircle around a central fire that had been burning since before Jon arrived. Because Mance ran a meeting the way a good host runs a dinner, the welcome is established before the guest walks in. Mance stood to one side, not at the head, which was either humility or tactical genius, because it meant the chiefs were already facing each other, and Jon stepped into the center rather than opposing a single authority. Smart man, Mance Rayder. Ed stood at Jon's back and managed to project a combination of attentiveness and profound personal doubt that was somehow reassuring rather than demoralizing. The chiefs were, Jon did a quick read, a varied collection that ranged from an enormous man with ritual scars on both forearms who introduced himself as Harag of the Frozen Shore, to a small, elderly woman with white braids and a bone-handled knife who said nothing during introductions and watched Jon with the specific attention of someone who has long since decided that most people are going to waste her time and is prepared to be unpleasantly correct about that. Jon Snow of the Night's Watch, Mance said. He's asked to speak. No preamble, no endorsement, just an introduction that was itself a test. Could Jon hold the room without borrowed authority? Jon looked around the circle. He didn't adjust his posture. He didn't soften the directness of his gaze. He'd learned from watching Mance that the worst thing you can do with people who respect strength is perform approachability. "The army of the dead is 3 miles north of this camp," he said, "and let that land. Let them react, a few sharp looks, a few sounds, the large man with the scars sitting forward. Last night we killed 3 whites in the haunted forest. There are more. They were moving south." "We know about the dead," said a thin-faced chief with a top-knot and the dismissive manner of someone who'd been surviving genuine horrors long enough to resent anyone implying they were new to the concept. "You know about the ones you've seen," Jon said. "You don't know the number. I do approximately because I've ranged further north than any of your scouts have gone, and I've been to where the Night King is gathering his army." He paused. "It's not dozens, it's not hundreds. The Night King has an army of the dead that numbers in the tens of thousands and grows every time it encounters the living. Every person who dies north of the wall becomes a soldier in that army. Every person you've lost in the last 2 years of marching south is walking behind you." The silence was total. "You brought them to our camp," the top-knot chief said. "The dead follow south because south is where the living are," Jon said. "They were coming here regardless. The only question is what the wall means when they arrive, a last defense or the place where everyone who should have been working together spent their last weeks fighting each other." He let that settle. Then he told them about Craster's Keep. He told it the way Sam had suggested, not strategically, not as an intelligence report, but as a story. The homestead in the forest, the old man's terrible bargain, the infants left in the snow, the way the White Walker had come for them in the night like something summoned from a nightmare that was also a memory. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The facts themselves were a horror that required no decoration. The old woman with the white braids, who had not moved and not spoken since Jon started, said, "The babies." "Yes," Jon said. "He gave them the babies," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact in a way that was worse than emotion. "And they used them." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time, then she looked at Mance. "He's not lying," she said with the confidence of someone who has developed very reliable methods of determining this. "He hates it too much to be lying. His name is Dalla," Mance said quietly to Jon. She is, the oldest memory of the Then people. "If she says you're telling the truth, they'll believe you." The large man with the scars, Harag said. "What do you want, Crow?" "Time," Jon said. 2 weeks. I've sent ravens south for food. I'm going to send more ravens south for something bigger, for weapons, for soldiers, for a southern force that can meet this threat with numbers instead of just commitment. 2 weeks, Harag said. "And after 2 weeks, we open the gate," Jon said, "and your people and mine stand on the same side of the wall." "Your order." "My order will come around," Jon said, with a certainty he didn't entirely feel but that he knew for the room, for this moment, for these people who could only follow someone who believed in what they were doing. He could not afford to let waver. "Or my order will be wrong and will proceed without them." Another silence, different from the others, more like a breath being held collectively. Harag looked at the old woman Dalla. Dalla was still looking at Jon. After a moment she made a small, decisive gesture, nothing dramatic, just a slight inclination of the head, the minimum amount of movement required to communicate a maximum amount of meaning. Harag turned to Mance. "I'll hold my people back," he said. 2 weeks. One by one around the circle the chiefs said the same, some more grudgingly than others, some with questions attached, conditions about food distribution, about where their people would be positioned south of the wall, about what authority they'd have over their own in the south. Jon answered each question directly. Some he couldn't answer, and he said so, which turned out to be more effective than false confidence. The old woman with the white braids stopped him on his way out. She was small up close, small and compact and very still in the way that very old, very dangerous things are still. She looked up at Jon with eyes that were sharp and dark and had seen more winters than Jon could comfortably imagine. "The Night King," she said. "You've seen him, once from a distance. Then he's seen you." She said it as a fact, not a warning. "He sees what he sees and he remembers it. Don't forget that." She turned away before Jon could respond, walking back toward the camp with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has said what needed saying and has no interest in discussing it further. Jon stood in the snow and felt something cold move down his back that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Cheerful old bird," Ed said from behind him. He was back at Castle Black by mid-morning, as promised. Thorne was waiting in the courtyard, which meant he'd been watching for Jon's return, which meant he'd known about the meeting the whole time and had chosen not to stop it. Jon filed that away. It was important, that choice, more important than the ones Thorne made loudly. A man's quiet choices told you more about him than his loud ones. "Well," Thorne said, 20 clan chiefs," Jon said, "all agreed to hold back from the gate for 2 weeks. All aware of what's coming from the north. And the old woman, the Then memory keeper, she confirmed what I've been saying about the White Walkers, independently. She's seen things herself that match everything I reported." Thorne received this, not warmly, not coldly, just received it, the way an experienced man receives information that changes a calculation he'd already made and has to make again. "And the food supply?" he asked. "Ravens are out. We should have responses within 3 days. "The men won't like it," Thorne said, "sending our stores north to Wildlings." "No," Jon agreed, "they won't, but they'll like being overrun considerably less." Thorne looked at him. "You know what your problem is, Snow." Jon waited. "You're not wrong," Thorne said. "That's your problem. If you were wrong, I could dismiss you. If you were wrong, the traditions would hold, the order would hold, and we'd be fine." He looked away toward the wall. "But you're not wrong, and that means every time you act without authorization, every time you make a deal I haven't approved or go out a gate I haven't opened, you're going to be right, and I'm going to be the man who tried to stop the one person who was right about all of it." He said it without self-pity, without particular bitterness. Just as a statement of the position he found himself in, assessed with the same clear-eyed practicality he applied to everything. Jon didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You could authorize the next one." "What?" "The next meeting. The next step, whatever comes after the food supply ravens." Jon looked at him steadily. "You don't have to agree with me, you don't have to like what I'm doing, but if you're acting for the Watch and the Watch's survival requires this, then it's not weakness to authorize it, it's the Watch doing its job." Thorne was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the courtyard and the wall creaked above, and Ghost sat by the gate, a white statue in the gray morning. "We'll see," Thorne said eventually. And walked away, which was, Jon reflected, the closest thing to yes he was likely to get from Alliser Thorne, and would have to be enough for now. He looked up at the wall. Somewhere south, 3 ravens were flying toward keeps and castles carrying urgent requests from a junior ranger who had no official authority whatsoever. Somewhere north, the army of the dead was moving at the pace of inevitability through the dark forest. And here in the middle, 100,000 wildlings, 400 crows, one increasingly complicated agreement, and 2 weeks that were already running. He went to find Sam. They had letters to write. Chapter 3, Fire and Bone. The food came on the 4th day. Not enough, it never would be enough, not for 100,000 people in the middle of a killing winter, but it came. 4 wagons from Winterfell's outer granaries, dispatched by Maester Lewin under Robb Stark's seal, accompanied by a short letter in Robb's handwriting that said, "Jon, whatever you're doing, be careful, Mother will not be pleased." And then below that, in smaller letters that looked like they'd been added after, "I believe you about the dead. I always believed you. Don't die." Jon read the letter twice, folded it, and put it inside his shirt. 2 more supply responses came by the following morning. A modest grain store from the Umbers, sent with all the warmth of people fulfilling an obligation they hadn't expected to be called on and resented slightly, and a larger contribution from a minor lord near Queenscrown, who had apparently decided that a request from the Night's Watch carrying the implicit endorsement of Winterfell was worth taking seriously. The total was not enough to feed 100,000 people for 2 weeks. It was enough to demonstrate that the ravens had been answered, that things were moving, that the commitment Jon had made to Mance had at least a partial foundation under it. He sent Tormund north with the wagons himself. Tormund received this task with a dignity that lasted approximately 4 seconds before dissolving into the kind of satisfaction a man shows when he's given authority he's wanted for years and is trying not to look too pleased about it. He organized a distribution chain with the forward camp that was efficient enough to impress even Gritta, who didn't impress easily. Jon watched from the wall walkway as the wagons moved through the gate, one at a time, slowly, the gate barely wider than the wagon bed, and felt the strangeness of it. Crow supply wagons rolling north through the wall, not something the Night's Watch had done in living memory, not something the 8,000-year-old protocols covered. Ed appeared beside him with 2 cups of something hot that was technically not quite ale and not quite anything else, and handed one to Jon without comment. They stood and watched the last wagon disappear into the tree line. "You know what the funny thing is," Ed said. "What?" "I've been in the Night's Watch for 11 years. 11 years of cold and short rations and nobody in the South caring whether we lived or died. And now here you are 2 weeks in, sending food to wildlings and making deals with Mance Rayder, and for some completely inexplicable reason, he paused. It feels more like the Night's Watch is actually doing something than it has in 11 years. Jon looked at him. "Don't tell anyone I said that," Ed added. "I have a reputation for pessimism to maintain." The attack came on the 6th day. Not from the south, not from Mance's people. They had held the agreement with the kind of disciplined precision that surprised everyone who had been certain they wouldn't, which was most of the Night's Watch. It came from the east, from a section of the haunted forest 2 miles from Castle Black, where the tree line reached closer to the wall than it did elsewhere, close enough that in summer you could stand at the base of the wall and throw a stone into the first trees. In winter, with the snow banks built up along the wall's base, it was closer still. A ranging party of 9 men led by a ranger named Thatcher found it, or rather, found the aftermath of it. A wildling camp of approximately 300 people, one of the outlying satellite camps that Mance had positioned along the wall's length to manage the spread of a 100,000-strong population. The camp was silent in the way that 300 people are never silent. 2 of Thatcher's men came back, the other 7 didn't. Thatcher himself came through the gate on his knees, which was how Jon found him in the courtyard, unable to stand, not from injury but from something else, the kind of shock that sits in the body rather than the mind. His face was the color of old ash. Jon crouched in front of him and gripped his shoulders. "How many?" Jon said. Thatcher's mouth worked. "Thatcher." "How many whites?" "Hundreds," Thatcher said. "Maybe more." The camp was all ready. He stopped, started again. They were all still there, all 300 still in the camp, walking. Jon stood. He was already moving toward the armory before the sentence finished. The force he assembled in 40 minutes was a different thing from the 7-man patrol he'd taken into the forest on the first day. That had been surgical. This was going to be a battle. He took 30 rangers, every man in the watch who'd seen combat and could be made ready fast, and he went to Tormund. Tormund listened to the account with his arms crossed and his face absolutely still, which was how Jon had come to recognize that Tormund was genuinely afraid of something rather than appropriately cautious about it. Fear in Tormund didn't look like fear. It looked like the suppression of everything that normally made Tormund Tormund. 300 whites, Tormund said. Moving east along the wall's base, Jon said. If they reach the tunnel approach, how long? 2 hours, maybe less. Tormund turned and started shouting in the old tongue. Around him, the forward camp erupted into controlled motion, the particular efficient violence of people who have been readying for a fight their entire lives and just needed a direction. 80 wildling fighters armed with axes and short swords materialized in the time it took Jon to get back to the gate. Torches, Jon said to both groups. Every person carries a torch and a weapon. The torch is not optional. If you're in the forest and you don't have fire, you're a liability. He looked at the assembled force, 30 black-clad rangers, 80 wildlings in furs and mismatched armor, ghosts sitting at the head of them, all with an air of calm, purposeful readiness. The 2 groups looked at each other with the carefully controlled discomfort of people who have been enemies long enough that stopping being enemies required conscious effort. "I don't care who you've killed or who's killed yours," Jon said, loud enough for both sides. "Right now and until this is over, the only thing that matters is that the dead don't add to their numbers. You fight next to whoever is next to you. You keep their back, they'll keep yours." He walked to Ghost and put his hand on the wolf's neck for 1 second, a habit, a grounding, and then moved north through the gate. The eastern section of the haunted forest was different from the stretch they'd patrolled before. The trees here were older, bigger, the canopy dense enough that the snow came down thin and the light came down thinner. In summer it would have been beautiful. In this gray winter it was a series of rooms in an enormous dark house, and things moved in the far chambers. Ghost ranged ahead. Jon moved behind him with Longclaw drawn, the white blade catching what little light existed, and around him the mixed force spread through the trees in a formation that wasn't quite anything either side would have called formal. It was organic, shaped by the terrain and by the instinct of people who'd been doing versions of this for years. He heard the camp before he saw it. Or rather, he heard what was wrong with the camp, the absence of sound that should have been there, the negative space of a living community that had stopped living. No fire crackle, no voices, no livestock. Just the sound of movement, irregular, weightless, the shuffling scrape of things that no longer had the relationship with the ground that living things have. The whites had been Varina's clan. Jon didn't know their faces. He knew their chief's name because it was on the distribution list Sam had drawn up for the food supply. He didn't know their faces, and he was grateful for that now, because what was in the camp was wearing those faces, and he could tell even from the edge of the tree line that they were not behind the faces anymore. 300 of them, give or take, moving through the ruins of their own camp in that aimless, directed way, aimless on the surface, directed underneath, like water finding a level. "Gods," said a ranger to Jon's left quietly. "Save the gods for later," Jon said. "Torches forward, archers on the flanks. We go in 3 lines, first line draws them toward the fire, second and third lines close from the sides." He felt rather than saw the resistance from both groups to a strategy delivered by a man who was officially nobody's superior in this combined force. And then he felt it evaporate because Tormund stepped up beside him and said, "You heard him," and that was enough for the wildlings, and the rangers moved because the rangers had been watching Jon for 6 days and had drawn their own conclusions. The first line went in with torches high. The whites turned, all of them in that sequential awful chain, heads moving one after another, faces orienting south toward the light and the heat and the living, and then they came. It wasn't a charge. Calling it a charge implied intent of the kind that requires a mind. It was more like a tide responding to a pull, 300 bodies moving toward the torches with the same patient, absolute hunger of the dead for the living, and the sheer number of them compressed the air somehow, made it feel like the forest itself was pressing forward. Jon went left, Ghost went right. The strategy worked the way a strategy works when it's built on real knowledge of the enemy, imperfectly and effectively at the same time. The first line held the center of the white mass, torches driving them back and sideways, creating a burn line that whites wouldn't cross. The second and third lines swept in from the flanks, and the wildlings' axes found skulls and limbs with the comprehensive brutality of people for whom hand-to-hand combat is a first language. But 300 was a different arithmetic from 3. The flanks were holding, but the center line was compressing, too many whites for the torch line to push back, bodies pressing forward until the sheer weight of them started to push the living backward regardless of the fire. Jon saw a ranger go down, Ferris, a young man from the Stormlands who joined the watch fleeing something he'd never specified, and one white was on him and 2 more behind it, and the torch Ferris held was knocked away and snuffed in the snow. Jon covered the distance in 8 strides, and Longclaw took the first white's head in a single horizontal arc. Not cleanly, the Valyrian steel sheared through, and the head stayed attached by a strip of something that had stopped being skin and started being ice, but effectively. The white dropped. The second one turned toward Jon, and he let it come and drove Longclaw through its chest when it arrived, which didn't kill it but gave him a lever, and he pivoted and flung it sideways into the torch of the ranger next to him, and it caught and burned in that fast, horrible blue-white way. He got Ferris upright with his free hand. The young man was bleeding from his forearm, a gash, not a bite, which mattered enormously, and his eyes were wide, but his feet were under him. "Stay with me," Jon said, and didn't wait to see if Ferris agreed. Ghost was doing extraordinary damage on the right flank in the way that 7 stone of apex predator does damage, total and specific and very fast. The wolf wasn't trying to kill whites, Jon had come to understand. Ghost knew they didn't die the way living things died. He was moving them, hitting hard, knocking them into each other or into the path of the wildling axes, using his weight as a disruption engine rather than a killing tool. It was intelligent in a way that made Jon's chest tight with something that wasn't quite pride but was related to it. The third line collapsed. Not catastrophically, not a rout, not a panic, but it compressed suddenly when a cluster of whites found a gap between 2 large trees that the formation hadn't adequately covered and pushed through it. Suddenly there were 20 whites behind the third line, and the formation went from a controlled 3-sided assault to a messy, circular brawl in the space of about 6 seconds. Jon heard Tormund's voice cut through the noise, big, carrying, edged with something that was authority in the way that only completely genuine things are, shouting in the old tongue and repositioning his fighters before the gap turned into a breach. Jon moved toward the breach. He went through the gap the same way the whites had, which was the shortest route and also the most insane, and he came out the other side between the whites and the scattered third line with Longclaw in one hand and his torch in the other, and for approximately 2 seconds he was between 30 whites in the wrong direction, and those 2 seconds were very full. He burned the closest white with the torch, took the arm off a second one with Longclaw, stepped hard to his right to make the third one redirect, and put it in the path of a wildling axe that was already swinging. The 3 whites immediately behind those 3 were slowed by the brief pileup, and the torch came down on 2 of them before they untangled. Then the third line reformed around him, and they were back to 3 sides. It took 40 more minutes. 40 minutes of burning and cutting and shouting and moving, 40 minutes of ash and the smell of wrong burning flesh, and the sound that whites make when they're on fire, which is not a scream because there's nothing behind it to scream but is still deeply unpleasant. 40 minutes of looking to his left and right and seeing black cloaks and fur cloaks fighting with the same focus and the same fire, and not seeing much difference between them. When the last white burned, the forest went quiet. Jon stood in the middle of the camp, what had been the camp, what was now an ash-scattered clearing with the structural evidence of lives that had been lived here, and breathed, which felt important. His left arm was bleeding from somewhere he hadn't felt happen. Longclaw was warm in his hand despite the cold, which wasn't something he'd noticed before, or maybe hadn't had the quiet to notice. The survivors gathered slowly, drifting back toward each other from the various corners of the forest where the engagement had spread. Jon counted, 30 rangers out, 27 back, 80 wildlings out, 73 back, 10 dead, total. In an engagement against 300 whites, he looked around at the people around him. Some of them were looking at him. Some were looking at each other with the particular expression of people who have survived something together and are only beginning to understand what that means. A wildling fighter, one of Harag's people, a woman of maybe 30 with a broken nose that had healed at an interesting angle and a short axe in each hand, looked at Jon and said something in the old tongue that he didn't quite catch. Tormund translated from 6 feet away. She says you fight like you have nothing to lose. What did you say? Jon asked Tormund. I said you have plenty to lose, you're just not afraid of it. Tormund shrugged, which is either the same thing or completely different, I'm not sure. Jon looked at the woman. She looked back at him with an expression that was evaluating and not unfriendly. Then she holstered both axes, turned, and walked back toward camp. Jon turned back to his dead. He buried them himself. Not alone, the surviving rangers helped, and 3 of Tormund's people who'd fought near the dead men and seemed to feel some claim on the burial, but Jon dug with them, which was not what ranking officers typically did and which nobody commented on. The ground was hard as iron in the cold. It took time. He said words over each one. Not the Seven's words, which he didn't believe in the way someone born in the north doesn't quite believe in a southern religion no matter how often the sept says otherwise. Just names and something specific he'd known or noticed about each man, because that was what Ned Stark had done for fallen men in the stories Jon had grown up on, and it was the thing that separated a burial from simply putting someone in the ground. Ferris, who'd come from the Stormlands running from something he'd never named, had the neatest handwriting of any ranger Jon had known. He'd helped Sam in the library twice without being asked. He said that. Tormund stood nearby during the burials and said nothing and kept his people respectfully quiet, which was more than Jon had expected and which, for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate, meant more than it might have in easier circumstances. On the walk back, Jon fell into step next to Tormund. They walked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that exists between people who have just seen the same thing together and don't need to identify it. 300 whites from one camp of 300 people, Jon said eventually. The camp was overrun sometime in the last 18 hours, probably last night. They didn't come from far north, Tormund said. Camp was established 6 days ago. Whatever killed them was close. Closer than before, Jon said. They're moving faster. The cold helps them. Tormund said it flatly. Keeps the bodies better, less rot, more function. I've heard the old women say it. Whites in deep winter are worse than whites in the thaw. Jon filed this. We need to adjust the camp positioning. All the outlier camps need to come within 1 mile of the wall. Close enough that a runner can reach help before. He didn't finish the sentence. I'll tell Mance. Tell him something else too, Jon said. He looked sideways at Tormund. Tell him the 2 weeks are going to compress. I said 2 weeks for food supply and negotiation. I should have said 1. We can't keep 300 people wasted in one engagement every few days. We need to be south of the wall and we need to start now. Tormund looked at him. You said 2 weeks to your brothers. I know what I said. And the ones who want to hold the gate forever. I know, Jon said. I'll handle it. You keep saying that. I keep being right so far. Tormund made a sound that was half laugh, half growl, and entirely typical Tormund. You're a strange crow, Jon Snow. You're a strange free man, Tormund. Tormund said with apparent satisfaction. I am. Thorne was in the courtyard when Jon's force came back through the gate. He'd clearly been told. Pike, who ran the watch rotation, would have sent word the moment the fighting started, and he stood with the particular contained attention of a man who has been waiting for an outcome and is now assessing the outcome against expectations. His gaze moved from Jon to the rangers to the wildlings following behind, and something shifted in his expression. Not approval, not quite. But something adjacent to respect that he couldn't quite prevent. Casualties, he said. 3 rangers, Jon said. 7 wildlings, in exchange for 300 whites. Eastern section 2 miles out. Jon stopped in front of him. The Varina clan camp, all 300 overrun sometime last night. They're gone. He paused. The dead army is accelerating. We have less time than I said. Thorne received this. His jaw was set and his eyes were moving through calculations. How much less? Days rather than weeks, Jon said. Maybe a week if we're lucky, less if the pace holds. The men just fought next to wildlings for 40 minutes and held the line, Jon said, together, and the 10 who didn't come back came from both sides in roughly equal number, which is the kind of thing people notice. He held Thorne's gaze. The gate needs to open. Not a crack all the way. We need Mance's full force south of the wall, and we need it organized, not a flood, a crossing with order and structure. That's only possible if your officers are managing it alongside Mance's. You're asking me to authorize. I'm asking you to survive, Jon said. We can argue about authorization after. The silence between them was different from before. It had a different weight to it, not the weight of two men opposed, but the weight of one man who knew the other was right and was in the process of deciding whether being right was sufficient. Bowen Marsh arrived from the far side of the courtyard at a half-trot, slightly out of breath. "The ravens," he said, looking between Jon and Thorne. "3 more came in while you were out." He held a clutch of small parchment scrolls. "Winterfell, more supplies, and Robb Stark wants a full report. The Umbers, conditional on Lord Commander's personal authorization." He paused, "and one from Castle Black's own rookery, private seal." Jon took that one. He didn't recognize the seal immediately. It was red wax, and the impression was a flame, a simple, stylized flame that could have been a personal device or an order's symbol. He broke it and read. The handwriting was precise and unfamiliar. The message was short. "The Lord's fire shows Castle Black in need of what cannot be supplied by ravens. I am coming. Save your decisions for my arrival." It was signed simply. Jon read it twice, looked at the flame seal, felt something that was not quite foreboding and not quite anticipation, but occupied exactly the space between them. "Who's it from?" Sam asked from behind Jon's shoulder, because Sam had appeared from nowhere again in the way Sam did. "I'm not certain," Jon said slowly, but he had a feeling. The red seal, the flame, the certainty in the phrasing, what cannot be supplied by ravens. He'd heard enough from ranging parties and travelers to have a shape for this person, even without a full name. "Red Priestess," Tormund said from 3 feet away, because Tormund had apparently followed Jon through the gate and was now standing in the middle of the Night's Watch courtyard with the comfortable assurance of a man who hadn't been invited and didn't require an invitation. He was looking at the seal with an expression of someone who has encountered that symbol before and formed a thorough opinion about it. "Arlor, the Lord of Light." Jon looked at him. "You know her. I know of her. She came through the far north 2 years ago, burned a man." Tormund paused. "I mean, she literally burned a man in a fire for her god." Another pause. He had it coming, if we're being honest, but the method was memorable. Sam had gone very still in the way that Sam went still when he was rapidly connecting multiple pieces of information and didn't yet know where they led. Jon folded the letter and looked at Thorne. "Whatever decision you're going to make about the gate, make it in the next 12 hours, because something else is arriving and I'd prefer to have the primary crisis managed before the secondary one walks in. And if I say no." Thorne said, "What then?" Jon looked at him steadily. "Then I open it myself." The courtyard was very quiet. Marsh made a small, involuntary sound. Ghost, who had been lying at the courtyard edge cleaning his shoulder wound with the methodical dedication of an animal who has decided that injury is an administrative inconvenience rather than a problem, looked up. Thorne looked at Jon for a long time, long enough that the silence became a kind of answer in itself, not the no that had been his answer to everything for weeks, but something else, something that didn't quite have a name in Thorne's vocabulary because he'd never needed it before. "Tomorrow morning," Thorne said, "I want the Watch senior staff assembled. Full council. You present everything, the dead, the numbers, the coalition you've built, all of it, on the record. With me present." He paused. "If the council agrees, I'll authorize the opening." It was more than Jon had expected. He was careful not to show that. "Tomorrow morning," Jon agreed. Thorne walked away. His back was straight and his step was even, and he gave nothing away. But Jon, who had been watching Alliser Thorne for 6 years, caught the one thing he couldn't quite contain. The fractional forward tilt of a man who has just made a decision he can't take back and is already walking toward whatever it costs him. Jon turned back to the assembled courtyard, rangers, wildlings, Ghost, and for a moment it was still, the way a battlefield goes still after the last sound has died, and in that stillness he could see what it looked like from the outside. 2 kinds of people who'd been enemies standing on the same ground, carrying the same ash and the same blood from the same fight, alive in the same way. Tormund clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him slightly, which was Tormund's version of a handshake. "One day," Tormund said, "you'll explain to me how you do that, the thing where you just say things and people listen." "I'm still figuring it out myself," Jon said honestly. "Well, figure it out faster," Tormund said. "That red woman is coming, and from what I remember, she's very much a person with her own ideas about what should happen. I'll deal with her." "You keep saying that about everyone," Tormund observed. "I keep meaning it," Jon said, and walked toward the great hall. He ate alone that night, or tried to. Sam arrived with a plate and a set of notes within 3 minutes, because Sam's radar for Jon being somewhere that required company and information was infallible, and sat down across from him and laid out the scrolls without asking. "I've been reading about the Night King," Sam said. Jon looked up. "Or rather, I've been reading about what the Meisters have written down, which is frustratingly incomplete because most of them didn't believe in him. which creates a kind of scholarly gap that is both annoying and potentially lethal. Sam pushed his spectacles up his nose. But there's a reference in one of the older texts, Septon Barth's Unnatural History, which most meisters consider unreliable, but which I increasingly believe is the only source with any. Sam, Jon said. What did it say? That the Night King was once a man, Sam said. A commander of the Wall, actually. And that he was made into what he is by a White Walker, a woman the text specifies, though I don't know why gender matters in this context, through some ritual involving the severing of memories. He paused, the point being he was mortal once and something made him, which means theoretically something can unmake him. Jon was quiet for a moment. The old thin woman said he'd seen me, that he'd remember me. Dalla, Sam said. He had already found her name somewhere and filed it because that was Sam. She's over 200 years old, supposedly, or she claims to be. The Then count age differently, so it's hard to. Sam. The Night King sees something in you, Sam said simply. She said it like it was a warning. I think it might be the opposite. What do you mean? Sam folded his hands on the table, a gesture he made when he was about to say something he was sure of and slightly nervous about. I think if the Night King specifically sees you, and by sees I mean in the way that he seems to see things, with that awareness, that ancient attention, then you matter to him in some way, and if you matter to him, then you're a threat he has to deal with. Which means you might be the actual solution to this, Jon, not just a man managing a crisis, the actual answer. He paused. I could be wrong. You're not usually wrong about the things you've read 12 books about, Jon said. No, Sam agreed, looking slightly alarmed at his own correctness. I'm usually not. Jon looked at the table. The food on his plate had gone cold. Outside the window the night was absolute and northern and old, and somewhere in the dark beyond the wall something was looking south with eyes that had been watching since before memory began. He had tomorrow's council. He had a red priestess coming. He had a gate that wasn't open yet, and 100,000 people who needed it to be. He had 10 newly dead men in a camp of 300 who were ash and empty ground now, and a Night King who had noticed him. He ate his cold food. It was still food. There was still tomorrow, and the day after that if he was careful. Chapter 4. The Red Woman's Game. She arrived at noon on the 7th day, and she arrived the way people arrive when they've decided that arrival itself is a statement. The column came down the King's Road from the south, soldiers in the vanguard, maybe 300 of them, bearing the flaming heart standard of House Baratheon quartered with something older and stranger. A sigil Jon didn't recognize at first and then did, because Sam had shown him a drawing of it once in one of his books. The Red Comet banner. Stannis Baratheon's host, moving north with the certainty of a man who decided where he was going and didn't require the road's permission. But it was the figure at the column's head that Jon watched from the wall. She rode a gray horse and wore red everything, red robes, red cloak, something at her throat that caught the pale winter light and held it longer than it should. She was tall in the saddle and her hair was a dark auburn that the wind kept moving, and even from 700 feet up Jon could see that she was looking at the wall with an expression that was not awe and not calculation, but something that combined both, the look of a person who has seen this place before in fire and flame and is now reconciling the vision with the reality. That's Stannis Baratheon, Ed said, slightly unnecessarily, because the flaming heart standard was somewhat distinctive. That's Stannis Baratheon, Jon confirmed, which means, Ed paused, that's a real king coming here with 300 soldiers. 300 at the vanguard, Jon said. I'd guess his full host is a day behind. He looked at the column, counting standards, reading formation. Maybe 5,000 total. 5,000. Ed was quiet for a moment. So we have 100,000 wildlings north of the wall, 5,000 Baratheon soldiers south of it, 400 Night's Watch in the middle, and something in a red dress. He exhaled. I wanted on record that when I joined the Night's Watch, the brochure, metaphorically speaking, there was no actual brochure, suggested a quieter life. Jon was already moving for the stairs. The council had happened that morning. Jon had stood in front of every senior officer the Night's Watch possessed, Thorne, Marsh, Yarwick, Pike, 6 other rangers, and laid out everything. The whites, the numbers, the engagement in the haunted forest, the acceleration of the dead army's advance. The deal with Mance, the clan meeting, the supply ravens and their responses. The old woman Dalla's warning about the Night King. He had spoken for 40 minutes without notes because Sam had offered to write him notes and Jon had declined because presenting hard truths with a piece of paper in your hand looked like you needed the paper. The room had been quiet in a way that was different from the usual councils. Not hostile quiet, not dismissive quiet. The quiet of men who'd been waiting for someone to say out loud the thing they'd been circling around privately for months, and who found the saying of it, however unwelcome, a kind of relief. Thorne had said nothing throughout. He'd sat at the end of the table with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between Jon and the other officers, reading the room with the experienced attention of a man who'd spent decades understanding how groups of people make decisions. At the end, Marsh had said, "If we open the gate, we need conditions, structure. We can't just open it and let 100,000 people walk through." "Agreed," Jon had said. "Mance will manage his side, we manage ours." Controlled crossing, clans in order, weapons checked at the gate, no more than 500 through at a time. "Weapons checked," Thorne had said, speaking for the first time since Jon started, flat and precise. "Not surrendered," Jon had said. "Check, there's a difference. We're not asking them to be prisoners, we're asking them to be organized." Thorne had looked at him for a long moment, then he'd looked at the other officers one by one in the manner of a man taking account. "The gate opens tomorrow," Thorne had said. "Controlled crossing, Jon Snow coordinates with Mance Rayder's people. I want every officer on that wall when it starts." He had paused. "This is the Night's Watch doing its duty. If anyone has a different view of what our duty is, I'll hear it now." Nobody had spoken. The council had ended. Jon had walked out into the corridor and stood with his back against the stone wall and his eyes closed for 30 seconds, which was the only celebration he permitted himself, and then he'd gone to write letters. And then Stannis had arrived. He met them at the south gate. Ghost beside him, Ed 2 steps back, Tormund, who had materialized at Jon's shoulder that morning with the easy permanence of a man who decided his place was there, and nobody was going to argue him out of it, 3 steps behind Tormund. Stannis Baratheon was shorter than Jon had expected. He'd heard the stories, the Iron King, the rightful heir, the man who held Storm's End on rats and boot leather while his brother Robert partied at King's Landing, and the stories had assembled themselves into something taller in his imagination. But the reality was a compact, hard man of perhaps 40, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone the wall was built from, and eyes that were doing what calculators do, continuously and without warmth. Stannis looked at Jon. Then at Tormund, then back at Jon. "You're the bastard," Stannis said. "Jon Snow," Jon said. "Yes, you've been corresponding with my steward about food supply. Without authorization from your order. I've been keeping 100,000 people from dying of starvation," Jon said. "The authorization question is secondary." Something moved in Stannis' face, not quite approval, not quite displeasure. The movement of a man recalibrating. "Your order has no Lord Commander. Not currently. You've been acting as one. Someone had to." Stannis studied him. The king had the particular quality of focused attention that Jon associated with very intelligent people and very dangerous people, and in Stannis these were the same quality. He missed nothing. He filed everything. He operated without the softening of social grace that most people used to make interactions bearable, not from cruelty but from a complete lack of interest in pretense. "I intend to offer my protection to the Night's Watch," Stannis said, "in exchange for the Watch's support of my claim to the Iron Throne." "The Night's Watch takes no part in the wars of the realm," Jon said. "The realm is about to end," Stannis said. "The traditional formalities are somewhat beside the point." "The traditional formalities are all we have," Jon said. "The moment this order takes a side in a southern war, we're just another army. Right now we can't afford to be just another army." He held the king's gaze. "But we can accept your protection as military aid against the White Walker threat, which is why you came north anyway, and you can accept our intelligence and operational knowledge of the threat, which is why you sent that letter. Neither of us has to call it political." Stannis looked at him for a long time. "Davos said you'd be like this. You discuss me with your hand. Davos discusses everyone. He's irritatingly thorough." But the edge in Stannis' voice when he said Davos's name was different from the edge he used for everything else, slightly less cold, almost imperceptible. The way a man refers to the one person he actually trusts. "Where's this Mance Rayder?" "North of the wall," Jon said. "I'm meeting him this afternoon. I want to be there." "That's not," Jon started and then stopped because he had a very fast, very clear thought about the strategic implications of a southern king meeting a wildling king with Jon Snow as the intermediary, and the thought was complicated but not negative. "Fine," he said. 2 hours. Bring Davos, nobody else." Stannis accepted this the way he seemed to accept most things, without visible reaction, but with internal processing that you could almost hear. Then the Red Woman stepped her horse forward and Jon looked at her and she looked at him, and everything in the courtyard went slightly quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. "Jon Snow," Melisandre said. Her accent was from somewhere Jon couldn't identify, not the Free Cities exactly, something older than that, or younger, or simply different in a way geography didn't explain. Her eyes were red. Not slightly unusual, genuinely red, the same deep crimson as the jewel at her throat. "I have seen you in the fire. I've heard that's something you do, Jon said. The smallest possible smile crossed her face. You're not afraid of me. I'm standing next to a direwolf and I have a sword made from steel that can kill things that can't be killed by anything else, Jon said. The list of things I'm afraid of is fairly specific. Your sword is not what protects you, she said, and your wolf is not what makes you formidable. She looked at him with those red eyes as if he were a text she was reading in a language she was still perfecting. The Lord of Light has shown me your face many times, always in darkness, always with fire behind you. That sounds like most of the situations I've been in this week, Jon said. Jon, Ed said quietly from behind him, in the tone Ed used when he wanted to convey perhaps we should be slightly more respectful of the unsettling magical religious figure. Melisandre's gaze moved to Ghost. The direwolf was looking at her with an attention that was different from how he looked at most people, not the flat assessment he gave strangers, but something more considered. She looked back at Ghost for a long moment and something flickered across her expression that might have been uncertainty, which Jon filed immediately because uncertainty on Melisandre seemed like important information. We will speak later, she said to Jon, privately. We'll speak when there's time, Jon said. Right now I have a meeting to prepare for. He turned and walked back through the gate. Behind him he heard Tormund make a small sound that was his version of impressed. The meeting north of the wall was not what Jon had planned, because plans rarely survived contact with Stannis Baratheon. What Jon had planned was a careful introduction, bring Stannis to meet Mance, establish that the Southern Crown acknowledged the Wildling King's authority over his people, build the framework for a three-way alliance that was actually two alliances running in parallel. What happened was that Stannis and Mance looked at each other across the fire and immediately recognized each other as the same type of person, which was the type of person who had been right about something important for a long time and had paid a significant personal cost for being right and resented everyone who'd refused to see it. You're the king in the north, Mance said. I'm the king of the 7 kingdoms, Stannis corrected, currently in the north. I've been king beyond the wall for 15 years, Mance said. Nobody gave me the title, I earned it, which is more than most kings can say. I earned mine, Stannis said with the absolute flatness of a man who does not exaggerate. Storm's End, Mance said. Yes, I know about Storm's End. He looked at Stannis with something Jon couldn't quite read. I was Night's Watch once, did you know that? I know, Stannis said. It's in the reports. Then you know what I walked away from and why. Mance leaned forward slightly. I walked away from an order that swore to defend the realm and then spent 300 years slowly forgetting what the realm needed defending from. He glanced at Jon. This one's different, but one man doesn't fix a broken institution. No, Stannis agreed, which is why institutions require kings. I am a king, Mance said pleasantly. Of people without a kingdom, Stannis said, not cruelly as a fact. The fire cracked, Ghost moved. Tormund watched from the edge of the circle with the expression of a man watching a play he's seen before and is curious how this version will end. Davos Seaworth, who had been sitting quietly to Stannis' left with the capable, attentive manner of a man who was worth 3 of everyone else in the room and was in no hurry to prove it, looked at Jon across the fire. Jon looked back. Davos said quietly to Jon specifically, "What do you actually need from this meeting?" Jon appreciated the directness enormously. Stannis' host south of the wall as a defensive line. Mance's people moving south in organized fashion, coordinated with the host so we don't have a war between them while trying to fight a war against the dead. And some kind of formal acknowledgement from both sides that the Night's Watch is the coordinating authority for both, at least north of the gate. Davos nodded slowly. Manageable. He cleared his throat. Your Grace, Stannis looked at him. The arrangement Jon Snow has described would place 5,000 Baratheon soldiers as a rearguard for 105,000 civilians and fighting folk moving south, while simultaneously establishing the Night's Watch as operational command for the initial defense. Davos said it with the calm precision of a man who'd learned that the best way to get Stannis to accept something was to present it as tactically sound before anything else. That's a strategically defensible position. It also keeps our host intact for the march south when this is over. A beat. When this is over, Stannis said, there's still a throne that needs to be sat on. When this is over, Jon said, there'll be people alive to argue about it. Right now there aren't enough of either of our armies to worry about which king they belong to. Stannis looked at him with those calculating eyes. Then he looked at Mance. Your people cross south of the wall in organized fashion. My soldiers manage the southern corridor and prevent complications with the local population. Complications, Mance repeated. 100,000 armed people moving through the north will frighten small folk, Stannis said. Frightened small folk create their own problems. Then tell your small folk not to be afraid, Mance said. Tell your people not to raid, Stannis replied. Another beat, then Mance said with a very slight inclination of his head that was not quite a bow, but was the closest thing to one he was probably capable of. Agreed. Jon exhaled. Tormund caught his eye from across the fire and made a face that said, "You're getting better at this." Jon made a face back that said, "Don't celebrate yet." Melisandre came to him that night. He was on the wall walkway, his place, the place he went when he needed to think, the place where the wind and the dark and the sheer physical immensity of the world made personal problems feel appropriately sized, and he heard her before he saw her, which was unusual because she moved very quietly. What he heard was the sound the jewel at her throat made in the dark. It produced a faint warmth, not light exactly, but the quality of light, a suggestion of red at the edge of the darkness that the cold shouldn't have allowed but apparently didn't bother. She stood beside him at the battlement and looked north, and for a while neither of them spoke, which Jon suspected was a tactic. "The king wants to sacrifice Mance Rayder," she said. Jon's jaw tightened. "It is the Lord's, no," Jon said again, with exactly the same inflection as the first time, which was not raised and not negotiable. Mance Rayder has held 100,000 people together across the worst winter in living memory and brought them south to safety. Burning him for the aesthetic pleasure of a fire god is not something that's going to happen. The king's blood, I don't care about the king's blood. Jon turned and looked at her directly. I understand that you believe in what you're doing. I understand that your fires show you things and that what they show you has been real often enough that you trust them. I'm not dismissing your faith, he held her gaze. But I will not let Mance die for a ritual when Mance alive is worth 100 dead sacrifices to whatever is coming from the north. Melisandre looked at him with those red eyes. In the dark on the wall, the wind was strong and it moved her hair and her robes, and the faint warmth of the jewel pushed against the cold in the very small space between them. You have power, she said. Not magic, not prayer, something else. The fire shows you haloed in, I have no word for it. Something that isn't light but behaves like light. She paused. I thought it was the Lord's gift when I first saw it. I'm not certain anymore. What else would it be? Jon asked. Yours, she said simply. Just yours, which is either more interesting or more frightening than a god's gift, depending on your perspective. I'd rather it be mine, Jon said. Things that belong to gods have conditions. She looked at him for another long moment, then, Stannis will push for the burning, he believes in it. Stannis believes in it because you've convinced him it works, Jon said, and maybe it does, but there are other ways to demonstrate the Lord of Light's favor that don't require burning the one man who's managed to hold this alliance together. He turned back north. Help me. Whatever you see in your fires, use it to help me protect these people. That's more useful than any sacrifice. You're asking a servant of the Lord to serve you instead, she said. I'm asking a powerful person to aim that power at the right target, Jon said. The Night King is the target, not Mance Rayder. Silence. The wall creaked. Ghost appeared at the top of the stair and walked to Jon's side and sat, and Melisandre looked at the direwolf, and the direwolf looked at her, and whatever passed between them in that long look neither of them translated. I will speak to Stannis, she said finally. I make no promises about what he'll hear. That's all I'm asking, Jon said. She turned to leave, then stopped. Jon Snow, she said his name like it meant something specific, the way you say a word in a language you're still learning when you finally understood its real meaning. The Night King knows you're here. He has known since the Fist of the First Men. He is not accelerating because of the season or the cold. She paused. He is accelerating because of you. She was gone before Jon could answer, her red cloak swallowed by the dark stairwell, the warmth of the jewel fading. Jon stood alone on the wall and let the wind take his breath. The Night King was coming for him specifically. He'd known it. Dalla had told him. Sam had told him in academic terms. But hearing it from Melisandre, who'd seen it in fire, who dealt in the language of certainty, it was different. It settled differently. He looked north. The wildling fires were there, banked and quiet in the late hour, and beyond them the dark of the haunted forest, and beyond that the long darkness of the true north where no fire burned and nothing warm lived. Right, he said to Ghost, to the dark, to himself. Ghost pressed his nose against Jon's hand once briefly. Then went back to watching the dark. The trouble started the next morning. Jon was at the gate supervising the first controlled crossing, 500 wildlings moving through in organized columns, Tormund running the wildling side with the efficient authority of a man who'd been waiting for a legitimate organizational role and was applying 30 years of suppressed logistical thinking to it when the shouting started from the southern side of the yard. He left Ed in charge and walked fast. 2 of Stannis' soldiers had a wildling man on the ground between them. Not a fighter, a thin older man, maybe 60, wearing furs that had been repaired so many times the original material was theoretical. He was face down with his arms pinned and he was not struggling, which made the soldier's grip on him look more like what it was. "What is this?" Jon said. One of the soldiers looked up, young, well-fed, armored in the clean steel of a professional force that had not spent the winter starving in a forest. "Caught him stealing," he said, "from the supply wagon." "What did he take?" A pause. "Bread, bread," Jon said. "3 loaves. Get off him," Jon said. The soldier hesitated. Jon looked at him with an expression that did not adjust and did not repeat itself, and the soldier made the correct decision and stepped back. The old man pushed himself up. His face was weathered and composed in the way that old men's faces are when they've stopped having enough energy for shame. He looked at Jon and said something in the old tongue. "He says he has 3 grandchildren in the camp," said Tormund, who had appeared at Jon's shoulder because Tormund had apparently developed the same proximity instinct as Sam but with better peripheral vision. "They haven't eaten since yesterday." Jon looked at the soldier. "You came north with 5,000 fighting men," he said. "Each of those men has a daily supply allocation. Calculate the surplus from men who aren't eating full allocation, men on watch, men not yet rotated to active duty. That surplus feeds the camp's most vulnerable first." He paused. "The children, the elderly, the injured, not because it's charity, because healthy wildlings who aren't desperate don't steal bread, and wildlings who don't steal bread don't give your soldiers reasons to put old men on the ground." The soldier looked at him, looked at Tormund, looked at the old man. "I'll need authorization from Sir Davos Seaworth," Jon said. "Find him. Tell him Jon Snow sent you. He'll authorize it." Davos, Jon had determined in the space of one conversation, was the most practically useful person in Stannis' entire operation, and was almost certainly the reason Stannis was still alive and sane. Soldier left. Jon helped the old man up himself, which made Tormund make a sound that might have been touching if Tormund was capable of being touched by anything that wasn't at least partially violent. "You know what your problem is," Tormund said conversationally as Jon walked back toward the gate. "Everyone keeps telling me I have problems." "Your problem is you keep solving things," Tormund said. "Every time you solve something, 3 more things need solving. You're creating a market for yourself. Better than the alternative being nobody solving anything and everyone dying." Tormund considered this. "Fair enough," he said. The real crisis came in the afternoon. Jon was in the command room. They'd cleared a storage space near the gate and put a table in it, because the war room needed to be at the wall rather than in the castle, when Davos came in with the expression of a man who has bad news and has decided the fastest route is the most merciful. "Stannis has Mance," Davos said. Jon stood up. "What?" "Soldiers picked him up at the forward camp during the crossing. Acting on the king's direct order, which means I didn't know until." Davos stopped. "He intends to burn him tonight. The Red Woman has been in his ear all day. She said she'd speak to him," Jon said, moving. "She spoke to him," Davos said, following. "I don't know what she said, but Stannis heard something in those fires this morning and he came out of that tent with his jaw set, and I've learned when his jaw is set like that." "Where is Mance?" "The holding tent, south perimeter." Jon was already through the door. He covered the distance in 3 minutes at a pace that was not quite running, because running through a military camp created panic, but was as close to running as he could manage without it. Ghost was with him. Tormund fell in from somewhere with the unerring instinct of a man who recognized trouble pace when he saw it. The holding tent had 2 guards. They moved to block Jon, and he stopped in front of them and looked at them with the particular quality of stillness that he'd developed. The stillness that wasn't passive, that was the opposite of passive, that contained everything that would happen if the stillness ended, and they hesitated. "Jon Snow," one of them said. "We have orders from the king," Jon finished. "I know, step aside." "We can't, then you'll need to stop me," Jon said. Quiet, level, true. Ghost sat beside him. The 2 guards looked at the direwolf and at Jon and made the correct assessment of what stopping Jon Snow would require and the specific form it would take, and they stepped aside. Mance was inside, sitting cross-legged on the tent floor with his arms bound behind him and his expression one of managed composure, the composure of a man who knows exactly what is coming and has decided to face it without the indignity of visible fear. He looked up when Jon entered. "Come to watch," Mance said. "Come to stop it," Jon said. Something crossed Mance's face, not hope exactly, but the movement of a thing that had stopped expecting and had been surprised by a reason to start again. "Stannis has made his decision," he said carefully. "Stannis has made a decision," Jon corrected. "He can make another one." He left Tormund with Mance and went directly to Stannis. The king was outside his command tent with Melisandre, and the image they presented was, Jon filed it rapidly, the image of a man who had been told by his god that something was necessary and was preparing himself to do necessary things. Stannis had that quality of settled purpose that was both admirable and genuinely terrifying. "Snow," Stannis said, "Your Grace." Jon said it without irony or sarcasm because this was not the moment for either. I need 5 minutes. The sacrifice, 5 minutes, Jon said, and then if you still want to burn him, you'll burn him knowing exactly what you're losing, and I'll have nothing more to say about it. Stannis looked at him, the jaw, the calculating eyes, then 5 minutes. Jon didn't argue the theology. He'd made that mistake once in his head, rehearsing arguments on the walkover, and discarded it. Stannis didn't care about theology in the abstract. Stannis cared about outcome. Mance Rayder is the only person alive who has the genuine personal loyalty of every major Wildling clan chief, Jon said, not because they fear him. Because he walked away from the Night's Watch and lived among them for 15 years and fought beside them and earned it. That loyalty is not transferable. It does not move to the next person in line. If you burn him tonight, 100,000 people who are currently crossing south of the wall in organized fashion and cooperating with your soldiers will stop cooperating. He paused. They won't fight you, they'll just stop listening. And 100,000 people who aren't listening become 100,000 separate problems that neither your 5,000 soldiers nor my 400 rangers can manage while simultaneously preparing to fight an army of the dead. Stannis was quiet. Mance Rayder is worth more alive than burned, Jon said, practically, operationally, in every way that matters for the task you came north to accomplish. Another silence. Melisandre was watching Jon with those red eyes and an expression he couldn't read and was increasingly suspicious of, not hostile, something more complex, some internal renegotiation happening behind those eyes that she wasn't sharing yet. You'd stake your word on his behavior, Stannis said finally. Yes, Jon said, he's a deserter from the Night's Watch. He's a man who made a choice, Jon said. So did I when I went beyond the wall with his people. So did you when you came north instead of pressing your campaign south. People make choices. The question is whether the choice serves the mission. Stannis looked at him for a long time. The kind of time that meant he was actually thinking, not just pausing for effect. He wears a collar, Stannis said finally. As a prisoner of the crown in my custody, he cooperates with the crossing and the organization of his people. When this is over, his fate is mine to decide. He looked at Jon directly. Not yours. It wasn't perfect. It was nowhere near perfect, but Mance was alive in it. Agreed, Jon said. Stannis walked toward the command tent. He stopped at the entrance and said, without turning around, 5 minutes was exactly right. If you'd taken 6, I would have stopped listening. He went inside. Jon stood in the cold evening air and let out the breath he'd been holding since Davos walked into the command room, and it came out long and unsteady and visible as mist in the cold. Melisandre hadn't moved. She was still looking at him. The fires showed me Mance burning, she said, quiet, carefully neutral. The fires were wrong, Jon said. The fires are never wrong, she said. They show what will happen if nothing changes. She paused. You changed it. Jon looked at her. Something in the quality of her gaze had shifted, fractionally, but there. The calculating certainty was still there, but underneath it, something less certain. Something that was, if he was reading it right, something close to genuine curiosity. The Lord of Light, she said slowly, as if working through something in real time, has shown me your face in every fire for 2 years. I assumed you were an instrument, a piece in a larger design. She was quiet for a moment. I am beginning to wonder if I had it backwards. I'm not a god's instrument, Jon said. No, she agreed, and there was something in the word that sounded like the closing of one door and the opening of another. You're not. She turned and walked toward the castle, her red cloak moving in the wind, and Jon watched her go and understood that whatever she was going to do next was going to matter, and that he'd shifted something in her tonight that might help or might make things considerably more complicated, and that he had no way of knowing which until it happened. He found Mance outside the holding tent. Tormund had cut his bonds, which was technically a crime, and Tormund was entirely comfortable with that, and the two of them stood in the cold evening air with the sounds of the camp around them. They're putting a collar on me, Mance said. Yes, Jon said. I am a king, Mance said, not angry. Precise, I know, Jon looked at him. You're a king whose people are alive and south of the wall. The collar is a political requirement for a man who needs a political solution. It's not who you are. Mance was quiet for a moment. Then in a different tone, quieter, less formal, you went to Stannis for me. You'd have done the same. I don't know that I would have, Mance said honestly. I like to think I would have, but you're 20 years younger than me and you've been doing this for about a week. He looked at Jon with an expression that was complicated and genuine and a little difficult to hold. Your father would be proud of you. Jon said nothing. The wind moved through the camp and the fires burned against the dark, and somewhere up on the wall a raven called once and was silent. The crossing will be done in 3 days, Jon said eventually. Then we need to talk about what comes after. The dead, Mance said. The dead, Jon agreed. All of us, together. Mance nodded once with the weight of a man agreeing to something much larger than the word itself contained. Above them, the wall stood against the dark sky, ancient and absolute, and no longer the line between enemies, just the line between the living and everything else. Chapter 5, Bone and Flame. The crossing took 4 days instead of 3. Not because of disorder, the crossing itself was almost unnervingly organized. Tormund and his clan coordinators running the wildling side with the kind of logistical precision that surprised everyone who had assumed that free folk couldn't form an orderly queue. It took 4 days because on the morning of the 3rd day, the dead reached the wall, not in force, not yet. But the advance elements, loose clusters of wights moving ahead of the main army like the cold moves ahead of a storm, arrived at the base of the wall in the gray pre-dawn while the crossing was still ongoing, and the attack they launched on the southern perimeter of the wildling crossing camp was enough to kill 9 people and turn the controlled crossing into something closer to controlled panic for approximately 40 minutes. Jon was at the gate when it started. He heard the screaming from the east and was running before he consciously decided to run, Ghost hitting full speed beside him. And what he found when he arrived was not the compact, manageable engagement of the haunted forest, but something more complicated. Wights pushing through a section of the camp that backed against the wall's base, the stone foundations creating a bottleneck that compressed both the living and the dead into a space too small for the torch strategy to work cleanly. Fall back from the wall. Jon shouted because the logic was immediate. Take away the bottleneck, give the torchline room. Everyone south 20 yards. Now, most people listened. Most. 3 didn't or couldn't, and when Jon drove into the cluster of wights to reach them, it was the most committed violence he'd done since the Fist of the First Men. Longclaw in both hands, no calculation, just the direct geometry of a blade moving between a sword and the people on the other side of it. He took down 4 wights in the time it took the torchline to reform, which was not something he would have been able to do 6 months ago, and he knew that, and filed it without pride because this was not the time for pride. The torchline reformed, the wights burned, the 3 people he'd reached were alive. After it was done, he stood in the ash in the cold morning light and looked at Longclaw, the Valyrian steel still warm in the cold air, and then looked at the wall above them, rising into the low cloud, and thought very clearly, we are out of time. He said it out loud to Tormund and Ed and Davos, who had all arrived at various points during the engagement and were standing in the aftermath with the collective expression of people who have been told something was coming and are now dealing with it having arrived. The main army is behind this, Jon said. These are the advance elements, scouts, stragglers, the freshest dead. The bulk of the army is maybe 2 days north. 2 days, Davos said. Maybe less, Jon said. The pace has been accelerating every day. Melisandre's been right about that much. They're moving toward something specific. Toward here, toward us. He looked at Davos and saw the older man calculating numbers, resources, positions, all of it moving behind those steady, practical eyes. Davos Seaworth, Jon had come to understand, was the most genuinely useful mind in this entire operation because he thought in solutions rather than positions, which was rarer than it should have been. The crossing needs to finish today, Davos said. Whatever's left north of the wall, it finishes today. There are still 30,000 people north of the wall, Jon said. They can't all move in 12 hours. Then we prioritize, Davos said. Children first, elderly, anyone who can't fight. The fighting folk come last because they're the only ones who can hold the rear. Jon nodded. Tell Tormund, he needs to hear it from me, but the organizing has to start now before the next cluster hits. Davos was already moving. The day that followed was the hardest kind of hard, not the clean, sharp hard of a battle, but the grinding, logistical, morally complicated hard of moving 30,000 human beings through a single gate at speed, while the dead pressed from the north and the living pressed from the south, and every decision about who went first had a human face attached to it. Tormund ran the northern side. Tormund at full operational capacity was something Jon hadn't quite seen before. The big man moved through the remaining camps like a force of nature that had been assigned a task, his voice cutting through noise and fear with the particular quality of authority that doesn't require explanation because it has never required explanation, rooted in 30 years of people watching him and surviving. Jon ran the gate. He stood at the tunnel entrance for 8 hours straight and managed the crossing with the systematic attention of someone who understood that the tunnel was the only variable that couldn't be expanded. 500 through at a time, moving fast, torchbearers at the front and rear of each column. He kept Ghost beside him at the northern entrance, not as a threat but as a signal, because the direwolf's presence at the gate was a visible reassurance to people who'd been living in the dark and the cold and the fear for months that something capable and certain was managing the threshold. He didn't eat. He didn't stop. Ed brought him water twice, delivering it with the wordless efficiency of someone who understood that stopping to say anything would cost time that wasn't available. The whites hit the perimeter 4 more times during the crossing. Each time, Jon left the gate to Ed and ran to the engagement and returned. Each time the engagements were slightly larger than the last, not overwhelmingly, but incrementally, the way water rises, each wave a little higher than the one before. By the time the last of the crossing columns came through the gate, 20,000 people having moved south in a single day, with 10,000 remaining north in the fighting rear guard, Jon's left arm was carrying 2 new wounds, neither serious, both adding to a collection that was becoming its own kind of record. "We need to close the gate," Ed said. He said it with the particular quiet of someone who has identified the necessary thing and is putting it in front of the person who has to decide it, not pushing, just presenting. Jon looked north through the tunnel at the last rearguard position. He could see Tormund's torch at the edge of the tree line, a single flame 300 yards north, steady and moving, which meant Tormund was alive and mobile, which was all Jon needed to see. "Not yet," Jon said. "There are still 10,000 people north of." "I know," Jon said. "Not yet." Ed looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained equal parts respect and profound personal misgiving, and then turned back to managing the tunnel. The Night King's vanguard arrived at dusk, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Jon saw it from the wall walkway, the tree line 3 miles north erupting with movement, not the scattered motion of individual whites but a mass movement. A tide, the haunted forest disgorging an army, the way a wound disgorges something that has no business being inside a living thing. Torches were moving in the middle distance, the rear guard falling back toward the wall in the fast, controlled retreat of fighters who know the shape of what they're facing. Stannis arrived beside him. The king looked north and said nothing for a long moment. "How long before they reach the wall?" Stannis said. "An hour," Jon said, "maybe less. My cavalry can't operate in the haunted forest at night against something that doesn't feel fear or pain," Jon said. "Your infantry holds the south side. Whatever comes through or over the wall, which it won't, the wall will hold against numbers. Your soldiers are the second line. You sound very certain the wall will hold." "The wall has held for 8,000 years, Jon said. It's not going to fall tonight." He believed it. He also knew with the cold clarity that had been his companion since the Fist of the First Men that the wall was a physical structure, not a magical guarantee, and that what it was built to stop had changed since the last time it was truly tested. But that was a problem for after tonight. "I need to go north," Jon said. Stannis turned and looked at him. "The gate closes when you're through. The rear guard is still out there, Tormund's people. Then they should move faster," Stannis said, not cruelly. As a strategic calculation, plain and honest as everything else, the man said. "I'll move them faster," Jon said. "Open the gate on my signal." He looked at Stannis directly. "You have 5,000 soldiers and the wall between you and whatever is coming. I have a direwolf and a sword. Trust me to use them better than you can use them." Something moved in Stannis' expression. Not warmth. Nothing in Stannis had ever been warm, but something proximate to it. The look of a man recognizing genuine capability in someone and acknowledging it without the ceremony that most people required. "Signal," Stannis confirmed. Jon went down the stairs at speed. He found Davos at the base, who handed him 2 lit torches without being asked and said, "The signal fires are positioned at the wall's base. 3 short, they'll see it from the walkway." "Thank you," Jon said. "Come back," Davos said. It was simple and direct and carried more weight than elaborate send-offs because it was just true. He meant it without drama as a statement of preference and practical necessity. "We need you considerably more than you apparently need fear." Jon almost smiled. Went through the gate. The north side of the wall at dusk with an army of the dead 1 mile out was a specific and extraordinary experience. The cold had a different character, sharper, somehow intentional, as if the temperature itself understood what was moving through it and was making space. The sound was wrong. A forest at dusk makes noise, birds, wind, small animals settling. This forest was making none of those sounds. It had been vacated by everything with a heartbeat. Ghost ranged 20 yards ahead through the darkness, a white shape moving between the trees, and Jon followed the wolf's movement rather than his own sight because Ghost's night vision was better, and Ghost's instincts about where the dead were was better still. He found Tormund's rear guard at the 400-yard mark, 300 wildling fighters arranged in a fighting retreat formation, moving backward step by step toward the wall while whites pressed them from the north. Tormund was at the center of the rear line, an axe in each hand, fighting with the comprehensive physicality of a man who had been built for exactly this and knew it. "Go," Jon shouted. "All of you move south now, I've got the rear." Tormund looked back and saw Jon, and his face did the complicated thing it did when he was between relief and fury. "What in the seven hells? Move, Tormund." "You ridiculous fine." Tormund turned and started driving his people south with a combination of volume and physical momentum that was like watching a boulder decide to become a sheepdog. Jon stepped into the space Tormund vacated. The whites came through the trees in the dozens, not the hundreds that were behind them, just the forward elements, the ones that moved fastest. Jon stood in the snow between the retreating rearguard and the pressing dead, and he worked. This was different from the haunted forest engagement. There was no formation here, no strategy, no torchline coordination. This was one man and one sword and 700 feet of wall behind him and one directive: hold the line long enough for 300 people to get through a gate. He didn't count. Counting was for when you had the mental space for counting. He moved right to take the arm off one, left to take the head off a second, back to avoid the reach of a third, forward again because retreating against whites was slower than going through them. And Longclaw was warm in his hands, and the snow around him was filling with ash, and the cold bit harder with every minute, and the sounds of the retreat behind him were getting fainter, which meant they were getting further from him, which was what he needed. Ghost worked in parallel, not the same engagement, but alongside Jon's, moving through the press of whites on the flanks and disrupting anything that tried to circle around Jon's position. The wolf was bleeding from 3 new cuts Jon could see and didn't slow at all. The whites he destroyed were replaced by more. That was always the arithmetic of this. You could kill whites indefinitely, and it made no difference to the army behind them, because the army behind them was vast and patient and had no concept of the cost of attrition. Jon wasn't trying to reduce the army. He was buying minutes. He'd been buying minutes for 7 days. He backed toward the wall slowly, deliberately, keeping the line from collapsing even as it shrank, and the wall rose behind him and the sounds of the gate were closer, and he could hear Tormund shouting in the old tongue and the sound of feet on stone. A white hit him from the left, not one of the forward elements, something bigger, newer, a white that had been a large man recently enough that the size hadn't degraded yet, and hit him hard enough to take him off his feet. He landed in the snow and rolled and came up, and the white was on him before he'd fully risen, and he drove Longclaw up through the underside of its jaw in a movement that was instinct rather than technique, and the white went still and he shoved it off and stood. His ribs screamed. He'd taken that hit on his left side and something wasn't right, not broken, but definitely not right. He filed it as information and kept moving. The wall was 30 yards away, 20, 10. He hit the signal fires with the torch still in his left hand, 3 short bursts, the snow hissing as the torch touched the fire, and the gate cracked open and he went through it, Ghost hitting the opening half a second before Jon and spinning around on the other side as if making sure. The gate closed behind them. On the other side, the sound of the dead pressing against the wall's base was like nothing Jon had ever heard, not loud exactly, but dense, constant, the weight of thousands of bodies against ancient stone, a pressure that was physical and somehow more than physical. The wall held, of course it held. Tormund was there. He grabbed Jon's arm the moment the gate closed and looked at his face with an expression that had long since abandoned any pretense of being anything other than what it was. "You are," Tormund said, "an absolute, I know," Jon said, "complete, I know, absolute nightmare." Tormund released his arm. Then, because Tormund was Tormund, he clapped Jon on the shoulder hard enough to jar the injured ribs, which produced an involuntary sound from Jon that Tormund had the grace to pretend not to notice. "All my people, all of them," Jon said. "I counted as they passed me." Tormund closed his eyes for 1 second, just one, then opened them. "Right," he said. "Right," he cleared his throat. "Your ribs, fine. You made a sound, fine," Jon said. The wall held through the night and into the next morning. The dead pressed at its base continuously, not attacking, not climbing, just pressing, an ocean of bodies against the stone, patient and absolute and cold. Jon stood on the walkway in the small hours and watched them from above and understood for the first time, viscerally and completely, what the wall was for, not just a barrier, not just a symbol. 700 feet of ice between the living and the specific kind of ending that the army of the dead represented, and from up here it looked exactly as absolute as it was always supposed to look. Melisandre came to the walkway at some point in the 3rd hour. She stood beside him and looked north and said, "He's out there, the Night King. I can feel him," she said, "through the fires, not the fires here." She touched the jewel at her throat briefly. "Through the fire and the Lord's light, he's present. He's close," she paused, "and he's aware of you, specifically. He knows you're on this wall." "You told me that," Jon said. I'm telling you again because he's closer than when I told you before. She turned and looked at him. The red eyes in the dark were strange and specific, a warmth that was unsettling because it wasn't human warmth but was warmth nonetheless. He will not try the wall tonight. He doesn't need to yet. He's gathering, consolidating. She paused. He's waiting for something. For more of his army to arrive, Jon said. Perhaps, she said. Or for something else. She looked at him with an expression that had been changing incrementally since their first conversation on the wall, like a painting being revised. The certainty was still there, but the shape of what it was certain about had shifted. I told Stannis to spare Mance. Jon looked at her. I looked into the fires this morning, she said. After our conversation, I looked again. The fires showed me something different. She stopped. Not Mance burning, something else. Something I don't have a complete language for. She was quiet for a moment. I have been in the service of the Lord for 30 years. I have seen things in the fire that were true. And sometimes I have interpreted them in ways that suited what I already believed. She said it carefully, with the precision of someone who finds admission difficult and is doing it anyway. I interpreted you as an instrument, a vessel, a thing the Lord had made for a purpose that was mine to direct. She looked at him. I was wrong about the direction. Jon said nothing for a moment. What did the fires show you instead? You, she said simply, standing here on this wall. With the dead on one side and the living on the other. And something, she stopped again. Something the fires don't show as fire. They show it as dark, but not the dark of the dead, a different dark. Something old and cold and present in a way that the dead aren't present, something with intention. The Night King, Jon said, aware of you, she confirmed, and afraid. The word fell into the cold air between them and sat there. Jon looked north. He's afraid of me, Jon said, not a question, processing. Something in you, Melisandre said, something that the fire shows as she pressed her lips together, as a combination of things that shouldn't be combined, ice and fire, old and new. Human and, she stopped, I don't know the word. Jon looked at Longclaw at his hip. The Valyrian steel, the sword that had shattered a White Walker like frozen glass. The sword that stayed warm in the cold. He thought about what Sam had said, you might be the actual answer, not just a man managing a crisis. He thought about what the Night King was, a man made into something else, something that required a specific undoing. He thought about Valyrian steel. The only two things that killed White Walkers, dragonglass, which was stone given force by the earth, and Valyrian steel, which was metal given force by dragon fire. Two things that contained the principle of fire inside them. Ice made flesh against fire made metal. The Night King had chosen him specifically. Jon Snow, who was something Sam had read about. Something Melisandre's fires showed in a language she didn't have words for. Something that made a 10,000-year-old monster accelerate his march south. When he comes, Jon said quietly to the dark and to Melisandre and to himself, he's coming for me, not for the wall, not for the living in general. Yes, she said. Good, Jon said. Melisandre looked at him sharply. If he's focused on me, he's not focused on the gate, Jon said. He's not focused on the crossing, on the coalition, on any of the things that are keeping people alive. He turned from the battlements. If the Night King wants me, I'll be the most findable man in Westeros. Jon, get some sleep, Jon said. We have things to prepare before dawn. He walked away from her along the wall walkway, and behind him Melisandre stood in the dark and watched him go with an expression that was, for perhaps the first time in 30 years of absolute conviction, something close to wonder. He found Sam in the library, of course he did. Sam was surrounded by more books than usual, which given Sam's usual relationship with books was impressive. He had 3 candles going and ink on both hands and a piece of parchment covered in increasingly excited handwriting. Jon, Sam looked up. He had the particular brightness of a person who has found a thing he's been looking for. Dragonstone. Jon sat down. Tell me, dragonglass, the entire island sits on a mountain of it, the biggest known deposit in Westeros. Septon Barth mentions it. 2 other sources I've found confirm it. A cache large enough to arm. Sam paused, calculating. Everyone currently south of this wall and then some. How do we get it? Jon said. Stannis has ships, Sam said. He controls Dragonstone. It's his seat. If he sent a ship tonight with orders to his garrison there, the dragonglass could be moving north within 2 weeks. 2 weeks is too long, Jon said. The dead army is at our door now. For the immediate fight, yes, Sam said. But Jon, what we're doing right now is holding, surviving. All holds them tonight and tomorrow and the next day. But eventually, Sam stopped. Eventually the Night King will find the thing that the wall can't stop. Which is what? Jon said, though he suspected he already knew. Ice, Sam said simply. Fire and dragonglass kill whites. Valyrian steel kills White Walkers, but the Night King himself, the accounts I've found suggest he can't be killed the same way. He's not a white. He's not exactly a White Walker. Sam pushed his spectacles up. He's the source. The engine, that he waved his hand, searching for the word. If you kill every white and every white walker but not him, he raises them again. He is the death itself, not just a commander of it. Jon was quiet. Dragonglass, Sam said, in sufficient quantity in the right hands. He looked at Jon. Longclaw takes down white walkers. What would it do to the Night King? I don't know, Jon said. Neither do I, Sam said, but I think you're the only person who's going to find out. The Night King showed himself at dawn. Jon was on the wall walkway with Stannis, Davos, Tormund, and 6 senior officers when the dead below the wall went still. Not all at once, sequentially, like a ripple moving through the mass of bodies, outward from a central point, one by one going motionless until 10,000 whites stood at the wall's base in absolute silence. In the silence, a single figure moved through them. Not a white walker in the way Jon had seen before, taller than any of them, wearing armor that was made of something that wasn't metal, something that caught the gray dawn light and held it differently, like ice holds light. Moving through his army the way a tide moves through water, without resistance, because the things around him were him, extensions of his will rather than separate being. He stopped at the wall's base and looked up. From 700 feet, Jon couldn't see his face clearly. He could see the direction of that gaze, cold and specific and rising, moving up the face of the wall with the patient, ancient attention of a thing that has been here before and is oriented by memory rather than sight. The gaze found him. Jon was certain of it, not as mysticism, not as Melisandre's fire vision, but as a plain and physical fact, the way you know when a person in a crowd looks at you directly. The Night King's gaze traveled up 700 feet of ice and found Jon Snow on the walkway and stopped there. Nobody spoke. The wind moved. Jon looked back. He didn't look away and he didn't adjust his posture, and he put his hand on Longclaw's hilt not as a gesture, but because it was warm and that was good. The Night King raised one hand. For a moment Jon thought it was a gesture at him, some ancient challenge, some signal. Then the dead at the wall's base began to move sideways, not at the wall, not at the gate, laterally, spreading east and west along the wall's length, and Jon understood immediately. He's looking for a weakness, Stannis said. He's not looking, Jon said. He already knows where it is. He turned to Davos, the east tower, where the wall's base meets the older stonework, the section that was repaired 300 years ago. He'd noticed it a week ago, flagged it as a structural inconsistency, put it in the back of his mind. It came forward now with the cold clarity of something that was about to matter. That's where they'll press. How do you know? Stannis said. Because it's the weakest point and he's been here before, Jon said. This isn't his first siege. He knows this wall better than we do. He was already moving. The breach attempt at the East Tower took 40 minutes to develop and 6 minutes to reach its crisis point. The whites pressed the old stonework at the base with the combined weight of hundreds of bodies, not trying to climb but to compress, to find the point where old mortar gave way to older ice, and for 5.5 of those 6 minutes the wall held. In the 6th minute something cracked, not catastrophically, not the wall falling, nothing so dramatic. A section of the old stonework at the base, no bigger than a doorway, gave inward under the sustained pressure of several hundred bodies, and suddenly there was a gap, and whites were flowing through it into the wall's base passage like water through a breach in a dam. Jon was there before the first white was fully through. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, which was its saving grace because it meant the hundreds of whites outside couldn't pour through all at once. They came in ones and twos, and Jon and Tormund and 6 wildling fighters held the passage while Stannis' engineers worked on the stonework behind them, and the sound of hammers mixed with the sound of combat in the enclosed space, until the noise was something that got inside your skull and stayed there. Tormund fought like something from a legend, both axes moving in overlapping arcs, not precise the way Jon was precise, but effective in the manner of a force of nature, clearing space around himself through sheer kinetic authority. He took a gash across his left cheek that he appeared not to notice and probably didn't. Jon held the center. He was injured, the ribs from the night before, 2 new cuts on his right arm from the patrol, and now something at his shoulder from the first white through the breach that he wasn't thinking about. He was also entirely functional, operating at a level that some analytical part of him recognized as extraordinary, and that the rest of him was simply using without analysis because this was not the time. Longclaw moved through the press of whites in the narrow passage, and the Valyrian steel did what Valyrian steel did. It was different from regular steel in ways that Jon had known intellectually, but was understanding physically now, in this cramped space under this specific pressure. It cut through whites the way a hot knife cuts ice, the material offering resistance and then offering none, and the whites it touched didn't reanimate, didn't get up. They stayed down. The passage held. 43 minutes after the breach opened, the engineers had the stonework repaired well enough to hold, and the gap closed, and the last white in the passage burned from Tormund's torch, and the sounds of hammering faded into the sounds of panting breath and the distant pressure of the army outside. Jon leaned against the passage wall and let the stone take his weight. Tormund was beside him. The big man's face was blood-striped and exuberant in the particular way Tormund was exuberant after surviving something significant. "Good fight," Tormund said. "People are alive," Jon said. "That is," Tormund agreed, "generally the goal." "Dalla," Jon said abruptly. The name had surfaced from somewhere while he was fighting, the old Then woman's warning, the thing she'd said about the Night King. He sees what he sees and he remembers it. "Where is she?" "In the camp." "Southern camp, yes. Why?" "I need to talk to her." Jon pushed off the wall. "She knows something, more than she said. She knows about the Night King's weakness." He moved down the passage. "She was talking around it when I met her. The way old people talk around the thing they're not sure they should say." "Old Then women," Tormund said thoughtfully, following him, "are not known for their reticence." "She was reticent," Jon said. "Which means what she knows is either very dangerous or very important." "Or both," Tormund said. "Usually both," Jon said. Dalla was sitting outside her tent in the southern camp in the middle of a battlefield-adjacent emergency, drinking something hot from a clay cup, with the serene composure of someone who has decided that serenity is the only reasonable response to a world that has been unreasonable for a very long time. She looked at Jon when he arrived and said before he could speak, "You fought the Night King." "I looked at him," Jon said, "from the wall." "That's the same thing," she said. "Sit." He sat. She poured him something from the clay pot that turned out to be some kind of herb tea that tasted like pine needles and something he couldn't identify and was very hot. He drank it. "You have something he wants," she said. "Not the sword, not the wolf, not your alliance or your cleverness." She looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes. "Blood." Jon waited. "The Night King was made," she said. "I told you this already, made from a man. The children of the forest made him. This is the oldest story, older than the wall, older than the first men coming to this land. They made him to fight the first men. A weapon. Weapons made from living things don't unmake cleanly." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "There is a bloodline, a thread of it, running through the world from when he was made to now. The blood that made him is the only blood that can unmake him." Jon was very still. "And you think," he started. "I don't think," she said. "The Fire Woman thinks I remember." She tapped her temple. "The Then people remember. We are older than most. We kept the stories when everyone else made them into myths." She looked at him steadily. "Longclaw kills White Walkers because it was made in Dragonfire, but the Night King is the first. He is the original. Steel is not enough." "What is enough?" Jon said. "Fire," she said. "Living fire, the kind that lives in blood." She paused. "Do you know what you are, Jon Snow?" He looked at her. "A bastard," he said. She made a sound that might have been a laugh in a more demonstrative person. "You are a bastard," she agreed. "And your father was—" She stopped. "Who was your father?" "Ned Stark," Jon said. "Lord of Winterfell." Dalla looked at him for a very long time. An expression moved across her face that was complicated and specific, and that Jon couldn't fully read, some combination of recognition and something that was almost grief. "The man who raised you," she said carefully, "and your mother." "I don't know my mother," Jon said. "No," she said quietly. "You wouldn't." She looked at Longclaw, at the sword that stayed warm in the cold, at the wolf that Ghost had become, the specific color of him, the specific red of his eyes. Jon thought about Sam, ice and fire, old and new. "Human, and you're telling me," Jon said slowly, "that the Night King—" "I'm telling you what the blood knows," Dalla said. "The fire in the sword, the fire in the wolf, the fire in you." She met his eyes. "You didn't survive these things by luck or cleverness, Jon Snow. You survived them because some part of you is made of the same old fire that made this world." She paused. "The Night King recognizes it. That's why he's afraid, that's why he's here." The cold outside was absolute and pressing, and outside the tent the army of the dead was pressed against the wall, and the Night King was somewhere in the dark with his ancient, specific fear. Jon held the warm hilt of Longclaw and felt it hum against his palm, not imagination, actually hum, a vibration so low it was barely perceivable, like the string of an instrument touched very lightly. "How do I use it?" he said. Dalla looked at him. "You already are," she said simply. He found Melisandre at the wall's base when he returned. She was standing in the cold with her hand pressed flat against the ice, not the stone base but the ice itself, 700 feet of it rising above her, and her eyes were closed and the jewel at her throat was burning so bright it cast red shadows. She opened her eyes when Jon approached. "I've been talking to an old Then woman," Jon said. "I know," Melisandre said. "The fires showed me the conversation." She looked at him with those red eyes, and the expression on her face was something he hadn't seen there before. not the calculating certainty or the directed intensity of a woman managing destiny. Something genuinely open, something that was, under everything else, almost relief. "She told you some of it," Jon said. "The rest," Melisandre said, "is in the fire." She paused. "Your fire, not mine." She touched the jewel at her throat, and then deliberately and meaningfully she took her hand away. "The Lord of Light sent me here. I believed I knew why. I believed you were an instrument for his purpose." She looked at him. "You are not his instrument. You are something the fire has been trying to find a word for since before Arlor had a name." She paused. "You are the word." Jon looked at the wall above them. The cold breath of it came down in waves. The dead on the other side pressed in their thousands. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He put his hand against the wall beside hers. The ice was cold, genuinely, absolutely cold, the cold of 8,000 years of endurance, and under his palm, almost imperceptibly, something warmed. "Tomorrow," Jon said again to himself, to the dead on the other side, to the Night King who was afraid. "I'm coming." Chapter 6. What the wall was for dawn on the 8th day came the wrong color. Not the gray-white of northern winter mornings, not even the occasional pale gold when the clouds broke right. It came red, a deep arterial red that bled up from the eastern horizon and stained the underside of every cloud until the sky looked like something that had been wounded and was still deciding whether to survive it. Jon stood on the wall walkway and watched it and felt the wrongness of it in his teeth. Ghost pressed against his side and whined. A sound Jon had never heard the direwolf make before, not fear. Nothing in Ghost was ever fear, but something proximate to it. An ancient instinctive recognition of wrongness that bypassed the wolf's usual composure. Below the wall, the dead were still. That was new. All night they'd pressed against the stone, that constant, dense pressure, the weight of thousands of bodies moving and pushing and testing. Now they were motionless, every single one of them, standing in their thousands with their dead faces turned upward toward the wall's crest. "That's not good," Ed said from Jon's left. "No," Jon agreed. "In my experience, when something very bad stops doing the bad thing it was doing, it's usually because it's preparing to do something worse." "Also my experience," Jon said. He looked east along the wall's length, then west. The white stretched in both directions as far as the early light reached, not randomly, not clustered, arranged. In formation, in the specific way that armies arrange themselves when they're waiting for a command. He looked north. The Night King was there, not at the wall's base where Jon had seen him yesterday. Further back, 300 yards from the wall, standing on a slight rise where the ground lifted out of the flat plain, a position chosen the way a general chooses a position, for visibility and authority. He was perfectly visible in the red dawn light, still and absolute, and even at this distance Jon could see that the Night King's gaze was on him. "He's not attacking," Tormund said, arriving at the walkway with a flatbread in one hand and his axe in the other, because Tormund managed to make even doomsday preparations feel domestic. "Why isn't he attacking?" "He's waiting," Jon said. "For what?" Jon didn't answer because the answer was for me, and saying it out loud in front of everyone on the walkway was the kind of statement that required the right moment, and this wasn't it yet. He went to find Stannis. The king was already in the command room, which told Jon that Stannis had been awake all night, which told Jon a number of things about Stannis that he already suspected, but now confirmed. Davos was there too, and the look Davos gave Jon when he entered, steady, assessing, carrying information, communicated volumes. "He's not attacking," Stannis said before Jon spoke. He's positioned his army in formation and stopped." Stannis looked at the table map which Davos had updated through the night with new position markers. "That is a decision." "What kind of decision?" "A challenge," Jon said. Stannis looked up. "The Night King knows this wall," Jon said. "Dalla told me he's been here before in another age, before the first long night ended. He knows what the wall costs. He knows the math." Jon moved to the table. "His army at the wall's base is a siege that could last months. The wall doesn't fall to whites pressing against it unless there's a structural weakness, and we've patched the one he found." He looked at Stannis directly. "He's not trying to bring down the wall. He's trying to draw someone out from it." "You," Stannis said, "no question in it." "Me," Jon confirmed. Silence in the room. Davos was looking at the table map. Stannis was looking at Jon. "Whatever you're considering," Stannis said, "I assume it involves going beyond the wall." "Yes, into a field containing 10,000 whites and the Night King." "Yes, alone." "Not entirely," Jon said. "Jon," Davos said his name with a particular quality, quiet, serious, the voice of a man who chose his moments carefully and had chosen this one. "What do you know that we don't?" "I know what I am," Jon said, and the simplicity of it stopped the room. "I've known pieces of it for a long time, and I've been collecting the rest this week. Dalla told me." Melisandre confirmed it from a different direction. "Sam's been reading toward it from a third." He looked at the men in the room. The Night King was made from living fire by the children of the forest 10,000 years ago, a weapon against the first men. And weapons made from living things carry a bloodline, a thread of the original making running through the world. He paused. That thread runs through me. I don't know all the reasons why. I know some of them, the sword, the wolf, other things that don't have clean names yet. He looked at Longclaw on the table where he'd set it. He can be killed, but not by an army, not by 5,000 soldiers or 100,000 wildlings or 400 crows. He can be killed by the specific thing he was made from turned back on him. Which is you, Stannis said, which is me, and Longclaw, and whatever it is Dallas says lives in my blood. Jon picked up the sword. He's out there waiting because he knows it too. He's been waiting since the Fist of the First Men when I first killed one of his walkers. He's been moving south specifically to find this encounter. Then let him wait, Stannis said flatly. He waited 8,000 years. He can wait longer. We reinforce the wall, get the dragonglass supply moving from Dragonstone, arm every living person south of this wall, and we face him on our terms. He won't wait, Jon said. That's the thing you don't understand about him yet. He looked at Stannis steadily. The Night King is not patient. He has the appearance of patience. The dead don't hurry because the dead don't experience time the way we do. But the Night King is not fully dead. He was made from a living man. He feels things. Jon paused. He feels the thing in my blood the way you feel a fire's heat from across a room. It's been pulling him south since I killed that white walker in the snow. He cannot stop moving toward it any more than iron stops being drawn to a lodestone. Jon looked north through the stone wall, through the ice wall, toward the red dawn and the dead army and the ancient figure standing in it. If I don't go out to him, he'll tear this wall apart stone by stone until he gets to me anyway. And more people die in that version. Stannis was very quiet. Davos said, "What do you need?" Jon almost smiled. Clear path to the gate, whatever Melisandre can do from the wall. She's been building to something with her fires. I've seen her working at it all night. And Tormund, Stannis repeated. He won't let me go without him, Jon said, and honestly I'd rather he didn't. Melisandre was at the wall's base when Jon came down. She'd been there since before dawn. Pike had reported it, slightly unnerved. The red woman standing alone at the wall's ice face with her hands pressed to it, and the jewel at her throat burning bright enough to be visible from the walkway. Around her feet in the snow, something had happened to the surface, not melted exactly, but changed. The crystalline structure of the packed snow altered into patterns that radiated outward from where she stood in shapes that were almost recognizable as something, and then weren't. She turned when she heard Jon approach. Her face in the red morning light was composed, but carrying something underneath the composure, an intensity that was different from her usual operating intensity, more personal, less managed. The fires have been burning since midnight, she said, building. Whatever the Lord has been saving for this place, for this moment, it's ready. She looked at him. And you? Ready, Jon said. You're not afraid, she said, not surprised by it past surprise. I'm afraid, Jon corrected. I'm going out there anyway, which is different. She looked at him for a long moment, then she reached up and unclasped the jewel from her throat. Just held it for a second. It continued to burn in her palm, not from the clasp, but from whatever it actually was, whatever it actually contained. Then she stepped forward and pressed it into Jon's hand. He felt it immediately, warmth, genuine warmth, not the suggestion of it, but the real thing, the kind of warmth that belongs to things that contain fire as a principle rather than a phenomenon. It sat in his palm and burned steady and ghost beside Jon, stared at it with intense red-eyed focus. I don't need, Jon started. It is not for you, Melisandre said. It is from you, your fire expressed outward. She closed his fingers around it. I've been carrying it for 30 years, and I think it was always meant for this moment in this hand. She stepped back. Don't argue with a woman who's been waiting 30 years. Jon looked at the jewel in his closed fist. The warmth moved up his arm. Thank you, he said. Come back, she said, exactly the way Davos had said it, simple and direct and true. There are things we still need to discuss about what you are. After Jon said, Tormund was at the gate with 2 axes and the expression of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. You knew I'd come, he said. I've known you for a week, Jon said. I knew you'd come. In my defense, Tormund said, I'm either going to witness the most extraordinary thing that's ever happened or die fighting the dead, and both of those are better ways to spend a morning than sitting on a wall watching. He paused. Ed is going to be furious. Ed is always furious, Jon said. It's his natural state. He finds it restful. Fair, Tormund said. Ghost was between them, facing the gate. Not sitting, standing, weight forward, the particular posture of a wolf prepared to move. Jon looked at the gate. The wood and iron of it, the 8,000-year-old certainty of it, the thing he'd refused to open 10 days ago because he hadn't trusted what would come through. the thing he'd cracked and negotiated and argued through, and finally opened because the alternative was worse than the risk. He thought about that version of himself 10 days ago, standing on the walkway above this gate, watching the wildling fires and making the calculation that said not yet. That version had been right in his reasoning. He'd known that even then, and he knew it now. Not opening the gate outright, forcing the negotiation, buying the time for structure and alliance and understanding, that had been right. What had been wrong was the rigidity of it, the belief that rightness of reasoning was sufficient without the human work of carrying people with him. He'd learned that. He was still learning it. He put his hand on the gate. "You know," Tormund said quietly beside him, "when we first heard a crow was coming to negotiate with Mance, I thought, small man, soft hands, southern manners, I thought, this will take half an hour and we'll be back to trying to climb the wall." He paused. "I was wrong about almost everything." "Almost," Jon said. "Your hands aren't that soft," Tormund allowed. Jon pulled the gate open. The cold on the north side of the wall was different from any cold Jon had experienced, and he'd experienced considerable cold. It was the cold of the Night King's presence, not weather, not season, but intention made temperature, the world obeying something that had been telling it what to do for 10,000 years. The dead were still. The formation held, thousands of whites standing motionless across the plain in the red morning light, and Jon walked through the gap in the line that the Night King had left, because the Night King had left a gap, because the Night King wanted him here and had arranged the field accordingly. Ghost moved ahead, not ranging this time, just ahead, steady, between Jon and the north. Tormund walked on Jon's right and said nothing, which was perhaps the most Tormund had ever said. The silence from Tormund was its own kind of language, serious, present, the silence of a man who understood the weight of what was happening and was choosing to carry it without words. The Night King stood on his rise 300 yards from the wall. From the ground, at this distance, he was extraordinary to look at, not in the way of beauty or power exactly, but in the way of something absolutely ancient that has never been anything other than what it is, something that has existed so long that its existence has become part of the world's architecture. He was wearing the strange, not metal armor, and he held no weapon, and he was looking at Jon with eyes that were the specific blue of deep ice in a glacier, not quite the burning blue of a white's eyes, something older, deeper, the blue of the original cold. Jon walked toward him. The whites on either side didn't move. The gap held. He stopped 20 yards from the Night King, and they looked at each other, and for a moment there was only that, the two of them, the ancient and the new, the made and the unmade, facing each other in the red morning on the cold plain north of the wall. The Night King had a face. That was the thing Jon noticed immediately and couldn't look away from. It was a face, not a mask, not a monster's grotesque, but a face that had once been a man's and still was, underneath the ice and the ancient transformation. There were cheekbones and a jaw and an arrangement of features that spoke of a humanity 10,000 years buried under everything that had been done to him and that he had done in return. Jon thought he was someone. He was made against his will, and he has been this ever since. He thought about Dala's words, the weapon that was made from a living thing, the making that couldn't be undone cleanly. He thought about what you owed a weapon that had been a person. The Night King moved. Not fast, not the explosive violence Jon had half expected. He moved with the deliberate, total certainty of something that has never hurried, because hurrying implies doubt about the outcome. He raised one hand and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, the kind of drop you feel in your lungs before you feel it on your skin, and the snow on the ground between them lifted in particles that moved sideways in the windless air. Jon raised Longclaw. The warmth in the sword was real and present and strong, stronger than it had been, as if proximity to the Night King intensified it, as if the fire in the Valyrian steel recognized what it was facing and responded. The jewel in Jon's left fist burned, and something in his blood, the thing Dala had named, the thing Melisandre's fires had shown her in a language she didn't have words for, moved upward through his chest like breath returning after being held too long. The Night King's hand came down. Jon moved to meet him. What happened next was not what Jon had expected, and not what he had planned, and was exactly right in the way that things are exactly right when they stop being planned and start being true. Longclaw came up between them, and the Night King caught the blade with his bare hand, caught Valyrian steel with fingers made of ice and ancient power, and where those two things met, the fire in the steel and the cold in the Night King's grip, the air cracked. Not like ice cracking, like the air itself, the ancient cold of this specific place, cracking along the fault line between two opposing principles that had been moving toward each other for 10,000 years. Jon felt it through the sword and through his hand and through his arm and into his chest, where something very hot lived and had always lived, had lived since before he knew what it was or what it was for. Night King's grip on Longclaw tightened. Jon let him take it, and reached forward with his left hand, the hand holding the jewel, Melisandre's fire, his own fire expressed outward, and pressed it flat against the Night King's chest. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the Night King made a sound, not a scream, something beneath a scream, older than a scream, the sound of something that has been one thing for 10,000 years, encountering the specific force that can make it something else. The blue eyes went, not dark, not out, but different. The ice blue shifting, moving, becoming something else in the fraction of a second before the end. Jon thought, it's almost like recognition. The Night King shattered, not like a statue shatters, not fragments and noise. He came apart the way ice comes apart at the edge of a warm spring, quickly and quietly and completely, the form that had been held together by the original making dissolving as the making itself was undone. The armor fell. The cold presence that had been pressing down on everything for 10 days lifted, physically lifted. Jon could feel it rising off the plain like fog rising when the sun hits it. And across the plain, 10,000 wights collapsed, all at once. The same sequential chain that Jon had seen when individual wights died, but running simultaneously through 10,000 bodies, heads dropping, knees going, every single wight folding to the snow in a cascade that moved outward from where the Night King had stood and reached the edges of the plain in under 5 seconds. Then silence, real silence. Not the wrong silence of the dead standing still, the right silence of a plain that had just become a plain again, cold and empty and ordinary, the way the world sounded before the Night King had filled it. Tormund was the first to speak. "Huh," he said. Ghost sat down in the snow beside Jon and put his nose against Jon's hand exactly once. Jon looked at the place where the Night King had been. There was nothing there, no ash, no fragment, no evidence of a man or a monster or 10,000 years of winter. Just snow and the cold morning air and the red sky beginning to pale towards something that was almost ordinary. He looked at Longclaw in his hand. The sword was warm, warm in the true way, not the fighting warm of recent use, but something deeper, the warmth of a thing that has done what it was made to do and knows it. He looked at his left hand. The jewel was gone, not dropped, not present. Gone the way things go when they've served their purpose and the purpose is complete. He breathed. "Right," he said. He walked back through the gap in the dead army, the dead army now. 10,000 bodies lying in the snow, still, actual still, empty of everything that had animated them, and Ghost walked beside him and Tormund walked on his right and nobody spoke. The wall gate was open. Stannis was there, Davos, Melisandre, every ranger of the Night's Watch, it seemed, and 36 wildlings who had crowded the wall walkway in the courtyard behind the gate. They were all looking at Jon with expressions arranged in various formations of something that was not quite belief and not quite relief, but the specific state between those things that exists when something impossible has just happened and the mind is still catching up to the evidence. Jon walked through the gate and stopped. The silence held for a moment. Then Tormund said with enormous satisfaction, "I told all of you he was too stupid to die." Something broke in the crowd. Not chaos laughter, a sound Jon hadn't heard in days and hadn't realized he'd been missing. The specific human sound of a group of people releasing pressure that had been building for too long, and in the laughter there was relief and exhaustion and the beginning of something that was going to take a long time to become what it needed to become. Melisandre was looking at her own hands, at the absence of the jewel she'd worn for 30 years. Her expression was not grief, it was something quieter. The look of a person who has put down a weight they've been carrying so long that they'd forgotten what their hands were for without it. She looked up when Jon approached. "Is it done?" she said. "It's done," Jon said. She nodded once slowly with the finality of a woman who has been waiting for a sentence to end and has finally heard the period. Stannis looked at Jon with those calculating eyes and then did something Jon had not seen Stannis Baratheon do in their entire acquaintance. He inclined his head. Not a bow. Stannis did not bow to anyone and Jon wouldn't have wanted him to, but a deliberate inclination, a specific recognition. "Well," Stannis said. And then, apparently finding that sufficient, said nothing else. Davos gripped Jon's arm briefly, the firm grip of a man who means it. "Told you to come back," he said. "Took your advice," Jon said. "The dead stayed dead. Not just the Night King's army, the wights everywhere, every risen corpse in every haunted corner of the true north, collapsed where they stood or walked when the Night King's consciousness that sustained them went out. Rangers who went ranging in the days that followed reported finding dead wights at distances of 50 miles from the wall, all fallen at the same moment, all now just bodies, cold and still and empty and mercifully permanent. The long night had ended, not with a battle of 5 armies. Not with a great southern war, with 1 man and 1 wolf and 1 sword and a jewel that burned with borrowed fire, on a cold plain north of the wall while the red dawn came up. The practical aftermath was, as practical aftermaths always are, considerably more complicated than the moment. The first difficulty was the 100,000 wildlings now south of the wall. They were there and they were alive and they were not going back north, which was not a request for negotiation but a simple geological fact, the way rivers don't go back up mountain. Mance had promised his people the south, and the south was what they had, and the question of what that meant practically, land, shelter, the relationship between the free folk and the northern lords who were going to find 100,000 new neighbors arriving whether they'd extended invitations or not, was a problem that was going to outlast everyone currently in this courtyard. Jon started on it immediately. He sent ravens to Robb Stark with a full accounting, the truth, all of it, the Night King and the dead and what had happened on the plain and what was going to be needed now. He sent ravens to the northern lords whose land bordered the Gift, the vast stretch of territory south of the wall that had been technically under the Night's Watch's authority for centuries and practically abandoned for most of that time. He sent a raven south to King's Landing that he expected to be ignored and sent anyway. He sat with Mance for 3 hours one evening, and they mapped the Gift on Sam's best table and talked about land and settlements and the particular challenges of people who had lived free all their lives learning to coexist with southern structures without being consumed by them. They can't be subjects, Mance said flatly, not in the way you southerners mean it. They'd rather be dead, and they've demonstrated recently that being dead isn't the barrier it used to be. They don't have to be subjects, Jon said, they have to be neighbors. What's the difference? Subjects answer to someone above them, Jon said. Neighbors answer to each other. He looked at the map. The Gift is 2,000 square miles, unsettled, unfirmed, timber and game and the best land in the north for sheep because the elevation keeps the summers cool. He looked at Mance. Your people know the north better than anyone alive. They could settle that land in a generation and manage it the way they managed everything beyond the wall practically without ceremony on their own terms. Mance studied the map, under whose authority, their own, Jon said, and the Watch's where it overlaps, and the North's where it has to. He paused. It won't be perfect. Nothing is, Mance said. No, Jon agreed, but it'll be real. Mance looked at the map for a long time. Then he put his finger on a spot, a good spot, a river valley with southern exposure and natural shelter, and said, "Here first." Jon looked at it, nodded. Here first. Stannis was harder. The king had come north with a mission, the long night was part of it, but the throne was the rest, and Stannis Baratheon was not a man who forgot the rest. He called Jon to a formal meeting on the 6th day after the Night King's death, in the castle's great room with Davos at his side and the particular quality of preparedness that meant he'd been thinking about this conversation for days. The Iron Throne, Stannis said. Yes, Jon said. My brother's bastards sit on it illegitimately. My claim is lawful and documented. I know your claim, Jon said. The North owes me support, Stannis said. I came here with 5,000 soldiers, and my presence held the southern side of the wall during the most critical period of this campaign. It did, Jon acknowledged. You also nearly burned the only man capable of keeping the Wildling crossing orderly, which would have turned the critical period of this campaign into a catastrophe. He held Stannis' gaze. I'm not dismissing what you did here. I'm saying the accounting is more complex than it looks from one direction. Stannis' jaw tightened. What the Night's Watch will do, Jon said, is what the Night's Watch has always done. We take no part in the wars of the realm. What I will do personally, not as the Night's Watch, is write to Robb Stark and tell him exactly what you did here and what your claim is worth in the north. He paused. I can't promise you a throne. I can't deliver you a kingdom. What I can promise you is an honest account of what happened here, told to the people who need to decide what comes next. That's not enough, Stannis said. It's what I have, Jon said. It's honest. That's rarer than you think. Stannis looked at him for a long, weighing moment. Davos, beside him, said nothing, just watched with those steady eyes. Your account to Stark, Stannis said finally. Unembellished, completely unembellished, Jon confirmed. Then write it, Stannis said, and stood and left, which was Stannis' version of acceptance. Davos lingered for a moment. He looked at Jon with the expression he used when he was about to say something he'd been sitting on. He'll never thank you, Davos said, for Mance, for the way you managed him. He knows you were right, and he'll never say it. I know, Jon said. Doesn't bother you. He held the line, Jon said. He brought 5,000 soldiers north when most men would have stayed south and called it strategy. He put himself between 10,000 wildlings and a frightened northern population and kept the peace while I was busy. He paused. I don't need him to thank me. I need him to go south and argue his claim and maybe, eventually, sit on a throne and not be a disaster for the realm. He looked at Davos. You'll help with that second part. Davos smiled, a small, genuine smile, the smile of a man who is used to being seen. I've been trying for years, he said. Try harder, Jon said. Alliser Thorne resigned his position on the 7th day. He came to Jon in the morning, not to the great hall, not formally, but to the wall walkway where Jon went to think, because Thorne had apparently learned Jon's habits the way Jon had learned Thorne's, which was perhaps inevitable after 7 days of existing in the same crisis. He stood beside Jon at the battlements and looked north at a plain that was now just a plain, the white bodies already being managed by ranging parties who went out armed with torches and spent their mornings in the deeply unpleasant work of making sure dead things stayed dead. The election for Lord Commander, Thorne said. It will happen when things settle, perhaps a month, perhaps 2. Yes, Jon said. You'll stand, Thorne said, not a question. I haven't decided, Jon said honestly. Thorne looked at him sharply. Don't be an idiot. I'm not sure the Night's Watch needs a Lord Commander who's… Jon stopped. Who was what? He still didn't have complete words for it. What I am, he finished. What you are, Thorne said carefully, is the man who just ended a 10,000-year winter by walking out a gate alone and doing something nobody else could do. He paused, and the pausing had visible cost. I have been wrong about you. Not about everything. I still believe most of what I believe about the Watch's traditions and the proper management of… He stopped himself. But about you specifically, I was wrong. It was the most extraordinary thing Jon had ever heard Alliser Thorne say, and it was extraordinary precisely because of how plainly he said it. No drama, no ceremony. Just a man who dealt in truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable, living up to his own standard. I'm resigning the position, Thorne said, effective end of the week. There are 3 rangers better suited to the day-to-day management of this castle than I am. Pike is the best of them. He looked at Jon. The Lord Commander election is separate from the daily management. Stand for it, win it, and then… He stopped again. And then do whatever it is you do, which appears to be solve impossible problems by treating them as inevitable inconveniences. He turned to leave. Sir Alliser, Jon said. Thorne turned back. Thank you, Jon said, for authorizing the council. For not stopping the gate. He held the man's gaze. It mattered. Thorne looked at him for a long moment. Don't be maudlin about it, he said, and walked away. Jon watched him go and felt something complicated and genuine that he didn't try to name. Sam found him that evening in the library, which was where Jon found himself when he needed to think and didn't want Ed's brand of comfort or Tormund's brand of enthusiasm or the particular quality of Melisandre's presence, which had become simultaneously more comfortable and more complex in the days since the Night King. Sam was already there, of course. Sam was always already there. I've been writing it down, Sam said without looking up. All of it, everything that happened, the negotiation, the crossings, the battle in the forest, the Night King. He paused. You. Why? Jon said. Sam looked up. Because in 100 years someone is going to claim it didn't happen. Someone is going to say the Night King was a story, that the whites were an exaggeration, that the long night was a hard winter and nothing more. And when that happens, he patted the parchment in front of him. There'll be this. Jon sat down across from him. Will anyone believe it? People will argue about it forever, Sam said cheerfully. That's what people do with important things. But the truth will be there, in writing, which is, he concluded with obvious satisfaction, why writing matters. Jon looked at the parchment. Sam's handwriting, neat and precise and genuinely good, the handwriting of a man who loved the practice of it. He could see his own name in several places. Don't make me a hero, Jon said. You are. Don't make me a hero, Jon repeated. Write what happened, what I got right and what I got wrong and what it cost. He looked at Sam directly. That's the only version that's useful to anyone who comes after. Sam looked at him for a moment. Then he dipped his quill and wrote something at the top of a new page. Jon could read it from across the table. Jon Snow refused to let the wildlings through the wall. That's how you're starting it, Jon said. That's where it started, Sam said simply. Everything came from that, one decision, not the right decision, not the wrong decision. He looked up. A decision that created the problem it was trying to prevent, and in creating it, forced the solution. He tilted his head slightly, which is more interesting than being right from the beginning, don't you think? Jon thought about 10 days ago, the walkway above the gate, the wildling fires, the cold calculation of not yet and everything that flowed from it. It's more honest, Jon said. Same thing, Sam said, and went back to writing. Ygritte found him on the 12th day. She didn't announce herself or send word or approach through any of the expected channels. She simply appeared at the wall gate in the morning with her bow across her back and her red hair loose in the wind, and her expression arranged in the particular combination of defiance and vulnerability that had been her default with Jon since the first time they'd met, which was in a situation that was also considerably dangerous. Jon was at the gate, of course he was. They looked at each other across the courtyard. You lived, she said. You too, Jon said. A pause. I heard what you did, she said. With the dead king, it had to be done. She looked at him with those eyes that had always seen him more clearly than anyone else, the eyes that had loved him and been furious at him and put an arrow in his leg and wept doing it. You know nothing, Jon Snow. I know some things now, he said. Not enough, she said. But the edge in it was different from before, less of a wound and more of an old habit, the habit of a person who has been using the same phrase for so long that the phrase itself has become a kind of intimacy. He crossed the courtyard to her. She didn't move toward him, but she didn't move back, which with Ygritte was the equivalent of an embrace, and when he stopped in front of her she looked at him with an expression that had stopped pretending to be only what it was performing. What happens now, she said. The gift needs settling, Jon said. Your people need somewhere to be. There's 2,000 square miles of good land and nobody to argue about who it belongs to. And the wall, she said. What happens to all of this? She gestured at the gate, the castle, the 8,000-year-old institution arranged behind him. We change what it means, Jon said. Not a line between enemies, a base, a northern post. He paused. A place that watches not for the free folk but for the dark. In case it won't, Ygritte said. Probably not, Jon agreed. But that's what the wall was always for, not to keep people out, to keep watch against things that don't have people's interests at heart. She looked at him for a long moment. You changed, she said. 10 days, Jon said. It was a busy 10 days. You were already changing, she said. Since the cave. A pause. You were always going to be whatever this is. She made a gesture that was vague and specific at the same time, encompassing him and the sword and the wolf sitting behind him and the wall beyond that. I was just too angry to say it. You can still be angry, Jon said. I'd rather you were angry in here than not angry in somewhere else. She looked at him for a long moment more. Then she unslung her bow and set it against her shoulder in the carrying position, not away, not surrendered, just held. A choice she was making about where she was and what she was carrying. I'm not your crow, she said. I know, Jon said. I'm not anything that belongs to any order or any crown or any. I know, Jon said. I'm just here, she said. For now, that's all I'm saying. That's enough, Jon said, and meant it completely. He was on the wall walkway the evening of the 14th day when Ghost came and sat beside him, and for a while it was just the two of them looking north at a changed world. The plain was quiet. The haunted forest stood dark and ordinary in the winter evening, just trees, just dark, the old malevolent presence of it gone with the army that had made it feel that way. The sky above was clearing for the first time in weeks, the cloud cover that had pressed down through the whole of the crisis breaking apart in the evening wind, and revealing stars that Jon had not seen clearly since before Hardhome, since before the Fist, since before he went north and understood what was up here. He looked at the stars for a long time. Ghost pressed his nose against Jon's hand, the familiar gesture, the grounding one. Jon put his hand on the wolf's neck and felt the warmth of him and looked north and thought about what it meant that the night was dark and full of stars instead of full of things that wore the faces of the dead. He thought about the gate below him. Closed now but not locked, there was a difference, and it was important, and Jon intended to make sure that everyone who came after understood it. Closed for the winter, opened for the need. Not a barrier between peoples, but a threshold, a place where the world divided and a chosen few kept watch over that division, not in fear of what was on the other side, but in understanding of what could come from beyond. He thought about his father. Not Ned Stark, who had been his father in every way that the word meant, in love and teaching, and the specific complicated gift of a bastard boy raised in a great house alongside its trueborn children, with all the pain that contained and all the love that also contained. But the other one. The one he still didn't fully know, whose blood Sam had been reading around the edges of for days, and whose name sat somewhere in a truth that the world wasn't quite ready for yet. Fire and ice, Dalla had said, old and new. Human, and Jon didn't have the word yet. Maybe the word didn't exist yet. Maybe he'd have to find it or make it or simply be it until the word for what he was emerged from what he did. He was 20 years old and he had held the wall against 100,000 wildlings and negotiated them across it and fought the dead in a forest and stood in front of the Night King with a warm sword and a borrowed fire and done the one specific thing that the world had been building toward for 10,000 years. He was 20 years old and he still didn't know his mother's name. He was 20 years old and somewhere in the southern camp, Ygritte was sleeping under northern stars, here because she'd chosen here, which was worth more than any arrangement or order or oath. He was 20 years old and Sam was in the library writing the true version of events, and Tormund was probably eating everything in the storeroom, and Melisandre was sitting with her empty hands learning what she was when she wasn't carrying a jewel she'd carried for 30 years, and Stannis was somewhere preparing to go south and argue his impossible claim with the absolute conviction of a man who has never in his life done anything less than his whole conviction. And the wall stood. It stood the way it had stood for 8,000 years, not because it was invincible, not because nothing could ever breach it, but because the people who chose to stand with it were willing to be the thing that made it real. Not stone and ice, people, imperfect, complicated, wrong and right simultaneously, people making imperfect, complicated, wrong and right simultaneously choices, and then living with them and learning from them and trying again. That was all the wall had ever been, all it needed to be. Jon looked at the stars for a long time, until he was cold in the productive way rather than the dangerous way, the way that meant he'd been outside long enough to think clearly. Then he turned and walked down the stairs. There was work to do in the morning. There was always work to do in the morning. And tomorrow, for the first time in 8 days, for the first time since the fires appeared on the northern horizon and changed everything, tomorrow was going to be a morning that was just a morning. Cold and early and full of problems that were the right kind of problems. The kind that came from people being alive and needing things and arguing about them. He went through the gate and it closed behind him, and in the courtyard Ghost ran ahead toward the warmth of the great hall, and somewhere inside the castle Ed was definitely complaining about something, and somewhere in the camp Tormund was definitely laughing about something, and the wall rose behind them all, patient and ancient and present and watching north in the way that it was built to watch, the way it had always watched. The way it would watch for as long as there were people willing to stand on top of it and call the watching worth doing. The night was dark and full of stars, and Jon Snow went inside.